Good afternoon. I'd like to call the workshop of June 26th to order. First on the docket, we have Rick Brereton from FB Environmental, who is a lead a contractor on the Lake Auburn water study. Rick, I'm going to turn over to you and let you introduce your team that I believe is remote in, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, councilors and staff and members of the public. It is my pleasure and my honor to present results from this analysis that incorporates regulatory, environmental, and economic analysis to studying the issue of the water supply protection for Lake Auburn for the city. Zooming in remotely are several members of the team that I'll introduce now, and they will be available for question and answer once the presentation is finished. Myself, I'm Rich Brereton. I'm the project manager for FB Environmental Associates from Portland, Maine. Also on the line are Laura Deemer, our environmental monitoring lead, and Forrest Bell, our CEO, principal in charge. From Horsley Witten Group, out of Exeter, New Hampshire, we have Ellie Baker, a senior environmental planner. And from the University of Maine, joining from Orono, we have Dr. Adam Dagno, a professor and economist from the School of Forest Resources. This story could start over 100 years ago in the 1880s when Lake Auburn was first used as a drinking water supply for the public. Or it could begin in the 1920s when the Auburn Water District was first formed. For our purposes tonight, we're going to start the story with the 2010s, when several important changes occurred that were not lost on anyone paying attention to what was happening with the lake. First, in 2011 and 2012, there were several algal bloom events, one of which in 2012, late summer, caused a fish kill of lake trout. Phosphorus, a naturally occurring chemical, but also can be enriched from human activity on the landscape, was the identified culprit. Environmental trade-offs from algal blooms were also no stranger to the situation in Lake Auburn. Good fishing in troubled water was the result of the algal bloom and fish kill, resulting in changes, trophic changes to the lake's ecology that resulted in banner years for landlocked salmon. But the problem persisted. Stakeholders weighed different options for fighting algal blooms, but then in the mid-2010s, there were widespread improvements in water quality that lasted until 2018, when some problems returned. Algal blooms caused persistent taste and odor issues, not resulting in danger to human health, but resulting in nuisances that were ongoing. And plans were made to battle this problem of phosphorus that is an enriched phosphorus leads to algal blooms. And so plans were made, and we'll go into the results of those plans, and we'll also go into the stages of analysis for the future. But accurately characterizing what's happened over the last 10 years is a building block for understanding environmental conditions in the future. So for this analysis, the charge from the City Council was to evaluate existing ordinances related to water quality protection at Lake Auburn. So far, I've been telling mostly an environmental story, but of course this analysis incorporates regulatory aspects and economic aspects. And inherently, there's a balance between different user groups for the lake, different user groups for the lake's watershed, which is inextricably linked to what happens within the lake itself. And we begin describing the analysis that we've done over the past 4 months with the environmental analysis to better understand changes that have occurred and changes that could occur in the future, to set the set the stage for considering economic trade-offs and cost benefit, and also what is to be done in the regulatory sphere. If any changes are to be made, then to what end should those changes be made? These are essentially informed by the regulatory analysis. So first I'll describe the work that we did to quantify water quality changes in the recent past and in the future. And then we'll move into our economic analysis. And then we'll discuss strengths and weaknesses with particular ordinances, and we'll wrap up with specific recommendations on policy and ordinance, and also holistic recommendations about what direction we believe the lake should be headed in the future. So I'll briefly describe the approach to the environmental analysis. The first step was, in some ways, the most effort-heavy step, to synthesize existing data and studies, to review both the raw water quality data and the work that's been done interpreting and analyzing that data, and then to build a model, a computer model of phosphorus and its effects on the lake, including algal blooms. And for that, we turn to the phosphorus cycle within the lake, incorporating inputs of phosphorus from the landscape, in stream flow, in nearshore inputs from the shoreline itself, from the atmosphere as dust deposition or as rainfall, and then from groundwater inputs, and then also outputs. So the terms of the phosphorus budget that lead to phosphorus being exported via streams and surface water, via groundwater in the subsurface. And then also, crucially, for this story, quantifying the internal cycling within the lake itself as the lake responds to and undergoes changes in response to that phosphorus loading in the form of sediment and organisms settling out and being deposited on the lake bottom surface, and then resuspension or biological activity bringing that phosphorus back into suspension and circulation, where it could again be available for algal growth. Then we'll describe some future scenarios developed and tested with this model, including additional development. And a key effect of additional development is to go from the top left corner here. I apologize for the size of this figure, but in a forested, naturally vegetated situation, the precipitation that falls on this landscape is going to be partitioned into the groundwater. Some of it is going to be evaporated or transpired by trees and other natural vegetation, and a smaller portion of it is going to be carried off as surface runoff. It's going to feed streams, it's going to run over land, eventually it's going to go into a receiving water body. That effect of development is to reduce that portion of rainfall or other precipitation that is traveling as runoff, to increase that proportion and to decrease the amount that is infiltrated and goes through groundwater. And that's a crucial change because the process of infiltration and flowing underground to a receiving water body like Lake Auburn achieves filtration not just of phosphorus but of other contaminants. When more water is running off, more contaminants are able to travel directly to the lake. So under a low-density residential situation, that runoff value increases. Under, as you might expect, under a high-density situation with lots of impervious cover in the form of pavement and rooftops, that runoff component is even larger. So we model those effects of development on the landscape in the lake watershed. And then we design recommended actions that are intended to maximize the benefit of the lake. We also use those recommendations to then retest future scenarios and assess the benefit that is actually being achieved via those actions. And it's crucial to note the role of uncertainty in this process. There are different forms of uncertainty that come into play in the process of modeling the phosphorus cycle in Lake Auburn or any other lake. And those come down to natural uncertainty in the form of variability in the environment, not just in lake processes, but in events that are rare but highly impactful on the lake, such as heavy precipitation events. And then there's also uncertainty in the methods and the assumptions that we make going into the modeling process. So the model is only as good as the data and the assumptions that are incorporated into it. And we've worked diligently to calibrate this model to existing conditions, to the data sets that are available, and to provide reality checks in the form of validation of the model as well. So I'll briefly describe this process. The first input to setting up and calibrating this model is to incorporate water quality data. And the most relevant data set to this modeling process is the most recent data. The last decade of water quality data is the most important input over a long data record because it is the most recent and most effectively represents conditions the lake is experiencing now in 2021. What I'm showing here is a typical time series of water quality data in the form of concentrations or levels of two different parameters in the lake. One is turbidity, shown in blue. Turbidity is the measure of attenuation of light as it travels through a substance such as water. So higher turbidity means less light penetration. That can be caused by sediments suspended, in the form of soil particles or other sediments. That can also be in the form of organisms like algae. And then in the green, you'll see total phosphorus. This is a measure of the amount of phosphorus in various forms within the lake over time. The phosphorus levels are on the y-axis on the right, running from 0 to 30 parts per billion. That's total phosphorus per parts water. And then on the y-axis on the left is the in-lake turbidity. And what I want to call attention to is this cyclical pattern with increases and decreases in the phosphorus levels. This smooth line here represents a moving average over time. And on the x-axis, we're showing data from 2011 all the way through to 2021. The initial input of the model was stopped at 2018. A couple of important milestones to note on this chart. The summer 2012 fish kill that I mentioned is here and aligns with the first higher concentration of phosphorus that was occurring in the early 2010s. The second milestone is associated with another increase in phosphorus, and I've marked as the milestone here the aluminum sulfate treatment in 2019, the summer of 2019, that was enacted to combat those high phosphorus levels and the resulting algal blooms. Another important point on this time series to call out is a key threshold here of 10 parts per billion, above which algal blooms occur much more frequently in the lake, and below which the problems are less likely to occur with algal blooms. That threshold will become important in interpreting our results of our analysis. The next input to the model is the watershed boundary. The watershed is a unit of the land surface where everything that falls as precipitation will either run off as surface water or will drain as groundwater into a receiving water body. In this case, The watershed is defined by the outlet of Lake Auburn. The watershed boundary was adjusted for the purposes of this model based on a data set from properties south on the south shore of the lake, and groundwater levels showed that the groundwater surface sloped away from the lake beyond a certain distance south of the lake, indicating that groundwater flow was in the opposite direction of the lake, and leading us to use surface topography in order to redefine the watershed boundary so that we had an accurate physical representation of the inputs to the lake. You can see the red circle here represents a high point in the groundwater table with contours showing the elevations moving away from that red circle. The arrows indicate the direction of groundwater flow. On the north side of this red circled area, water flows north toward Lake Auburn. On the south side, water flows south, away from the lake. So we made that adjustment in the line in black, shown on the figure on the left. The old watershed boundary is shown in purple on that same figure. So that adjustment was made. That update removed about 148 acres from the watershed of over 9,000 acres. So it was a small area of the watershed, but significant because of the nature of the land use in this area, which is a gravel pit undergoing active extraction. Land uses like that in the model are modeled to generate more phosphorus. So it was a not insignificant removal of a land use from the watershed. The next step was to update land use in land use characterization in the watershed for the most current data set that we could access. Aerial imagery is key in updating land uses from what they were described in the past. This series of maps here shows land use changing from 1997 to 2010 to 2020. And these changes in land use change the input to the model by generating different levels of phosphorus based on impervious cover and the types of other cover that make a difference for how much runoff is generated and how much phosphorus load is generated. It may be subtle to see in these figures, but there are small areas of development removing forested or in some cases agricultural land and substituting it for different densities of development. The overall effect of that 23 years of development in Auburn is to remove 65 acres of forested from our analysis. 65 acres are developed, 35 of those acres are agricultural, and 30 are forested over that time period. In the watershed, the towns in the upper watershed, Turner, Minot, Hebron, and Buckfield, the conversion to developed land is slightly higher, 110 acres developed over that time period, of which 15 were agricultural and 95 were forested. So overall, considering the entire composition of the watershed, that was a change from about 76% forested to 74% forested. This value closely approximates a threshold that's been noted in other studies, including studies done by our company, FB Environmental, looking at other lake watersheds. Crossing to underneath 75% forested is associated with significant water quality changes, not right at the threshold, but approaching it and then going beyond it is associated with negative water quality impacts. So that might seem like a small change of 2%, but projected over decades into the future, it becomes increasingly important. Other inputs to the model, I won't walk through all of them. I'll just highlight a couple of important ones. Precipitation and air temperature are important, and we used most recent precipitation and air temperature data we were also able to input projections for future precipitation and air temperature. There are some important soil properties that come into play for generating surface runoff and phosphorus load. Soil concentrations of phosphorus are also important for modeling that generated phosphorus load. Unpaved roads, which are often missed by GIS layers of official roads, can be a very important source of sediment, which can carry phosphorus with it. And then livestock estimates are another really important input into this model. And livestock and agriculture in general can have an outsized effect on phosphorus load in a watershed. I say outsized, meaning for a given unit of area, agriculture can contribute significantly more than forms of development for residential or commercial purposes. So these livestock estimates are based on the best available county level data and then downscaled to the amount of agriculture within the watershed. And then model execution takes on several stages. The most important point to make is that the watershed load model is first characterized using the MapShed model. And then that load is carried to the lake along with other inputs, the atmospheric load, the load from septic systems, and then the internal load, and modeled in the lake loading response model, which is a model that takes into account trophic changes in the lake, including the growth and decline of algae and other species. The model is calibrated using observed water quality data to accurately represent existing conditions. Another quite important term is the outputs, not just in surface water in streams, but also water withdrawal for a lake that is a water supply. This is an important term. Each gallon of water withdrawn carries a concentration of phosphorus, which is lost from the system and eventually discharges into the Androscoggin River. So leaving out that phosphorus from water withdrawal would overestimate the amount of phosphorus remaining within the lake. So first, to introduce the model results and existing conditions, I'd like to point out that the alum treatment that took place in the summer of 2019 was quite effective based on the total phosphorus data and the results of the model. There was a 78% reduction in the internal phosphorus load to Lake Auburn. It's not unprecedented, but it's on the higher end of effectiveness of alum treatments. What alum does is binds phosphorus within the water column and causes it to sediment out to the bottom, and it prevents or inhibits resuspension of those sediments or biological extraction of those sediments containing phosphorus. So the result in the lake was a reset of phosphorus levels from 10.9 parts per billion above that 10 part per billion threshold in 2018. That's an annual average concentration. Maximums and minimums can fluctuate around that annual average, but that annual average was above 10, down to 8.3 parts per billion in 2020, after the season where the alum treatment was active. So that in-lake phosphorus average concentration was down to levels that were much less risky for algal blooms. So as a way of comparing existing conditions pre-alum treatment and post-alum treatment, we look at a y-axis of total phosphorus levels from 12 parts per billion down to 8 parts per billion, and an x-axis of time. The 2010s water quality with its frequent blooms and taste and odor complaints is here on that scale of 10.9 for 2018. We estimate that those conditions would result in a 40% annual risk of blooms, and along with those, taste and odor complaints. Moving forward to 2020, the bloom risk is significantly reduced to 10%, and likely no taste and odor complaints, along with the much less frequent algal blooms. So now the model is calibrated to existing conditions, and it's time to use the model to project into future scenarios. And for that, we need to characterize what the change in land use from development will be. We also have to incorporate changes in precipitation and temperature from expected results of climate change. And we project forward to 2100, a year that is relevant to the expected course of development, as I'll show in a moment, but also relevant in projecting the effects of climate change on precipitation and temperature local here to northern New England. That 2100 year is an endpoint for many of those models. So we use that as a time benchmark in order to model our scenarios. In order to quantify how much and how long development will take, we use a build-out analysis, utilizing a proprietary software that takes into account existing zoning, existing development constraints like soils, setbacks, road frontages. It takes into account existing buildings so that it's not modeling the building of new projected buildings on top of where development has already occurred. We estimate growth rates using either, usually using census data, but in this case, we used, for the specifics of the Lake Auburn watershed, we used historical growth rates based on our land use analysis, which we felt was a much more accurate way to characterize growth within the watershed with its unique development constraints. And of course, the existing tax maps for parcel level data. And then we make certain assumptions about the suitability of parcels based on the efficiency with which a given parcel can be subdivided into smaller parcels. All of these pieces are put together into the Community Viz software. The Buildout wizard projects buildings onto the existing tax map, and the results are a GIS layer of projected buildings and a timeline to achieve the hypothetical condition of full build-out, where no more buildings can be built under existing development constraints and buildable areas. Full build-out is expected to occur in 2188, so 170 years from now. We downscale those results to the relevant time frame for building our scenario. And we can use those projected buildings to model changes in the watershed. So to show you what development constraints look like under existing conditions, I apologize for the size of this map. A few important points to point out here. The watershed is outlined here. The projected buildings are shown as yellow points, and the development constraints are shown in this map. So wetlands and water bodies are removed from the build-out analysis, deemed unbuildable. Setbacks and frontages are taken into account. The existing zoning, including resource protection. Resource protection is an important limit on buildable area, so the shoreland zoning is incorporated here. Conserved lands are shown in green, so in this case, conservation easements and other forms of land conservation are incorporated in light green, and then the lands owned by the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission are shown in a darker shade of green here as being not available for development. And then an important development restriction is the the soils for siting septic systems for subsurface wastewater disposal in the watershed. There is a standard of the requirement for 36 inches depth from the bottom of the organic horizon to a restrictive layer such as bedrock or the water table. So using NRCS web soil survey data, we outline those non-buildable areas in this pink color here. So that is also a significant area of development restraint. And then of course the existing buildings restrict parcels that are subdivided within the model can be built on, but not ones with existing buildings already incorporated. So we term the condition of building out the watershed as business as usual. We simulate that full build-out condition, and then we adjust land use and septic system inputs into the model of phosphorus. So business as usual, as the name implies, is no code or ordinance changes or other policy changes. So now in this map, existing buildings are still shown in yellow, but projected buildings are shown in red. And to quantify that full build out, 239 buildings are projected within city limits in Auburn, compared to the existing 419 buildings, so a 57% increase. The upper watershed towns are significant contributors to new buildings within the watershed, with Turner alone having 477 new buildings, as you can see from the dense number of points within the town of Turner. At full build-out conditions, with our projected land use conversion, we expect that to result in 550 acres of forest converted to developed land, going from 74% of the watershed covered by forest to 59% of the watershed. A small proportion of agriculture would also be converted under this scenario of full build-out, business as usual. 130 acres of agriculture would be converted, resulting in a drop from 6% of the watershed to 3% of the watershed. So to put this in our now familiar XY chart here with, again, total phosphorus on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, we're now projecting out to 2100. And the model results tell us that this business as usual scaled back from the year of full build out to 2100 will result in in-lake concentrations of 9.5 parts per billion phosphorus. It's important to note here that uncertainty comes into play again because of the uncertainty inherent in making assumptions and relying on existing data to model conditions that haven't happened yet. Climate change in particular poses an increase in uncertainty, an increase in variability in these concentrations, such that the risk from 9.5 parts per billion phosphorus in 2100 is higher than the risk of the same or equivalent close concentrations in 2018 or 2020. So even though 9.5 parts per billion phosphorus is lower than the 10.9 parts per billion we came from in 2018, we're estimating an unchanged risk of blooms of 40%. It's also important to note that this projected scenario incorporates regular use of alum to treat phosphorus. So on a regular basis, alum treatments are applied in order to control phosphorus. So we've gone back close to that 10 parts per billion phosphorus threshold, but now we no longer have the ready impact of an alum treatment to reset that value back down to below 9 parts per billion, where we were sitting in 2020. With that bloom risk, of course, comes the likelihood of taste and odor complaints, We estimate that the effect on turbidity, to drive turbidity up to the threshold of 5 NTUs of turbidity that constitutes a violation event of the filtration waiver, is unlikely in this scenario, simply because the highest recorded turbidity values in the lake have only risen as high as 3.5, 3.7. And so we have not seen that condition of conditions that violate the filtration waiver. It's also important, uncertainty comes into play again here with the risk of harmful algal blooms, where certain species of cyanobacteria, commonly referred to as blue-green algae, can produce as a byproduct of their metabolism compounds that are harmful to human life. And so, along with that risk of algal blooms, we have not seen this in Lake Auburn yet, but cyanobacteria could start to produce not just a nuisance, but a potential risk to human health. So, business as usual is still below that important 10 part per billion threshold, but risk levels have climbed to roughly where they were before the original alum treatment in 2019. Next, we looked at a set of changes to codes and ordinances that would relax restrictions on development. Working with city staff, we identified code and ordinance changes that would be realistic, would not be too far in the direction of relaxing codes, but would represent a significant enough change to the existing regulations that those changes could be perceived in the model. This consisted of rezoning of 3 village nodes style developments where existing zoning would be changed to either general business or neighborhood business in order to allow more density in a historically quite common pattern of development around village centers. So the location of those nodes was here in North Auburn, here in East Auburn, and here in the Townsend Brook Road area. We also modeled the removal of that 36-inch septic standard to take away that development constraint. And then we also considered removing the protection from development of the Watershed Protection Commission parcels. And it's important to note that no code or ordinance changes were applied to the upper watershed towns. We only modeled what would theoretically be would be within the city's purview to change. And the results of this analysis in terms of full build out, quantifying the number of new buildings, it jumped from business as usual of 239 new buildings up to 748 new buildings. No change to the new building values in the other towns because, as I mentioned, no changes were modeled to their codes or ordinances. The difference in watershed land cover from business as usual was significant. So going from 74% in current conditions, remember from the business as usual scenario it was 59% forested. In the maximum development scenario, as we term this, we go to 43% watershed coverage. That's a total of 1,150 acres of forest converted for development. There was a very small difference in the change in agriculture that was converted to development, and that's simply owing to the fact that the land cover, the land cover types of agriculture constitute a much smaller proportion of the Lake Auburn watershed, so there's less to develop in the first place. But in this scenario, 138 new acres would be converted. So to position this, this maximum development hypothetical scenario in our now familiar terms, we've got 2020 conditions down here at 8.3 parts per billion annual average total phosphorus. In business as usual, we climbed to 9.5 parts per billion. In the maximum development scenario, again, incorporating regular alum treatment, we climbed to 10.7 parts per billion phosphorus, so nearly equivalent to the 2018 levels. But again, I want to stress that 10.7 parts per billion phosphorus in 2100 incorporates a lot more uncertainty and risk than the equivalent concentration would in 2018 because of those factors of climate change and the inherent uncertainty there. We estimate that the bloom risk in this condition would be 80%. That's an 80% annual bloom risk, or 8 out of 10 years. In this situation, the key threshold, 10 parts per billion threshold, has been passed, and the effect on turbidity is still quite uncertain. But in this scenario, we estimate that a filtration plant would likely be needed, if not for turbidity violations, then for persistent nuisance, taste, and odor complaints, and the possibility, the risk, increased risk of cyanobacteria blooms. Recreational benefits in this scenario would also decrease, and I'm going to say some more about recreational benefits and the possibility for increase and decrease in those benefits in our economic analysis in a moment. But I want to focus in on our analysis of recreation impacts of swimming, which has been a subject of public debate, and the possibility of swimming on the lake has been consistently asked of us to evaluate. The simplest explanation is that the primary concern for primary bodily contact with water is pathogens in the form of human or animal fecal material conveying pathogens like bacteria and viruses into a drinking water source. It's not phosphorus that's the primary concern here, and the impact of swimming would likely be only a very small and insignificant increase in the phosphorus load. But that doesn't mean that the possible impact on pathogens should be ignored. But for phosphorus and the knock-on effect of algal blooms, with appropriate restrictions, swimming should not have an adverse impact on the phosphorus situation in the lake, i.e. algal blooms and turbidity. We'll go more into some specific recommendations about those appropriate restrictions at the end of the presentation. But swimming and other forms of recreation do figure into our economic analysis, which I will go into now. So we've established these two scenarios, the business as usual and maximum development scenario. And we've categorized the most important costs and benefits to the current scenario, or the current state of affairs, the business as usual scenario, and the maximum development scenario. So the first cost categories are in-lake or intake water treatment. We've looked at the alum treatment costs, and we've figured those into all scenarios. We've looked at the filtration plant costs and assumed that the business as usual scenario would not require filtration, but that the maximum development scenario would require filtration plant. We've also factored in operations and maintenance costs for that filtration plant. And we'll show both capital costs for the filtration plant and the cost of the estimated cost of financing that filtration plant to look at net benefit. Another category of costs and benefits are direct costs to the city and to ratepayers who benefit from the water from the water supply. Lake protection costs in the form of contributions to the Watershed Protection Commission. We've assumed that they will increase in the business as usual scenario due to the effects of increased development in the watershed, essentially more work for Watershed Protection Commission to do. And then that increases more in maximum development. We also looked at the property tax collected under the current scenario and estimated the potential increase under the two future scenarios. And then we factored in the impact on water rates with a smaller increase in business as usual and a larger increase in maximum development scenario. And then we factored in the recreational benefits. And we assumed that that swimming would be included in both scenarios, the business as usual and the maximum development scenarios. Boating and fishing, we assumed that no change in those economic benefits would happen under business as usual, but that negative impacts would happen under the maximum development scenario. And then hiking, trail-based or land-based recreation on public land would see no change in business as usual, but there would be a very important impact on that value under the maximum development scenario, because again, we modeled the effect of the Watershed Protection Commission lands being open for private development. So in looking at the current status of property values and putting the Lake Auburn watershed in context with the rest of the city of Auburn, we're showing city limits and a heat map showing lower values in the greener colors and higher values in the red colors. And as would be expected, the downtown areas have the highest valuations. It's important to note that there's a ring of brighter colors around Taylor Pond that is not quite as present around Lake Auburn, and that is a direct result of the lack of building that's taken place due to those development constraints around Lake Auburn. We estimate the current total valuation in the Lake Auburn watershed at $147.4 million. Put that in context of all of Auburn, that's nearly $2.2 billion. So as a percentage, the Lake Auburn watershed is sitting at about 7% of the total valuation of the city of Auburn. So assuming a mill rate of 23.75, that's a difference, or that's a approximate tax collection of $3.5 million within the Lake Auburn watershed versus $51.4 million in the city at large. Now we use current valuations and tax collection to estimate the potential under these build-out scenarios. Under business as usual, potential tax collected, assuming no change in the mill rate, goes from $2.1 million under current conditions to $3.3 million, a change of about $1.2 million. Under the maximum development scenario, the potential tax collection goes from $2.1 million to nearly $6.4 million, change of $4.3 million. And that is as a result of the increased building values from all of those projected buildings, which are, to remind you, are shown in yellow for the business as usual scenario and shown in red for the maximum development scenario here. So to put it all together into annualized form, to estimate the net economic impacts from the different scenarios, we've got unchanging costs of in-lake treatment. We've incorporated an annualized cost for filtration capital cost of $1.6 million. This is assuming, based on a review of different treatment technologies and costs, an average cost of $40 million for filtration plant. And that's consistent with estimates specifically for Lake Auburn and with Dr. Dagno's review of other systems around the country. For annual operations and maintenance costs, we also use an average value of $1 million per year. And for the cost of financing, it's about $700,000 a year. For watershed protection costs, we see a small increase, a a doubling under the maximum development conditions. For tax collected benefits, as I just showed in the previous slide, those increase from 2.1 to 3.3 under the business as usual and 6.4 under the maximum development. Swimming benefits under business as usual are not insignificant, valued at about $230,000. Under the maximum development scenario, we're incorporating an assumption of a halving of that value due to water quality degradation. Trail recreation benefits are estimated at nearly $500,000 and unchanged in the business as usual scenario, and decline significantly under the maximum development scenario, only what's left from other forms of conserved lands in the watershed. Boating and fishing benefits see a decline related to water quality, both in the business as usual and in the maximum development scenarios. So to sum it all up in terms of net economic impact, there is a change from current in the business as usual scenario of an additional $1.2 million. Under maximum development, we're estimating a change from current of almost $200,000. So there's nearly $1 million greater net benefit in the business as usual scenario. Now that uncertainty piece comes and rears its ugly head again here, and we have to mention these items that are very difficult to make assumptions about, but additional phosphorus reduction is something that must be considered both in the watershed and in lake treatment based on the uncertainty and risk inherent in projecting out to 2100. There are different forms of in-lake phosphorus treatment, such as hypolimnetic oxygenation, which the capital costs are probably on the order of 1/10 of the costs of a filtration plant. And there are other watershed retrofits and other protection measures that could be factored in here as well. We've chosen not to quantify those additional costs here because of the inherent uncertainty. But we've also chosen not to quantify the effect of cost sharing with Lewiston and with other municipalities into the net economic benefits. If one were to assume a halving of the cost and therefore increasing the net economic benefit to Auburn, the cost sharing would act in favor of both scenarios here, the business as usual and the maximum development scenario. But the additional phosphorus reduction would counteract it in the opposite direction, adding additional cost. There we go. So of course what this analysis suggests is identifying ways to expand development that minimize water quality impacts is the sure route to maximize the net economic benefit. So we did some of this analysis. We looked at potential ways to decrease the environmental impact of development in the form of regulatory strategies or practices that could be undertaken that would reduce the impact of each unit of new development. Collectively referred to as low impact development, these techniques seek to reduce the creation of new impervious surface to serve new residences. They also seek to limit the conversion of open space, especially forested land, to preserve more. So practices like clustering development to limit the amount of impervious surface created by new roads to serve these new developments keeps that new impervious surface coefficient down for each new unit of housing. So imposing a limit on clearing of a site like 10,000 square feet for house, lawn, driveway, and septic is a recommended measure in the Maine Department of Environmental Protection Stormwater Manual. Vegetated buffers around all natural resources are another recommended measure. and revegetation after clearing and grading, and reducing clearing and grading as much as possible so that construction generates less sediment that's available to be carried away by stormwater. And lastly, disconnecting impervious surfaces from their receiving waters by enhancing infiltration is one of the most effective low-impact development techniques out there. There are many different ways to encourage infiltration, to slow the water down and let it sit on the land surface long enough to drain into the groundwater system. But it can be artificially enhanced by infiltration best management practices, such as this infiltration trench here, which incorporates a crushed stone subsurface so that flow can be channeled off of this lawn and into this crushed stone matrix that allows for greater infiltration rates. The watershed loading model from MapShed makes incorporating these types of BMPs streamlined, and so we did this process, incorporating BMPs like these into both of our future scenarios to assess those positive impacts on phosphorus loading. So again, I'm showing the maximum development scenario here and the business as usual scenario here in our matrix of total phosphorus and our time of 2100. Adding in low impact development, or LID for short, we see a reduction of forested conversion from 43% to 50%. We see a decrease in annual average total phosphorus of 0.6 parts per billion down to 10.1 parts per billion. So still above that threshold, but a quite a significant decrease in modeled annual average phosphorus, and a bloom risk that declines from 80% to 50%. Under the business as usual scenario, when you add in LID, as you might expect, with less development, there's less benefit to the low impact development, but the benefit is still quite measurable, resulting in less forested conversion, 1% less forested to be exact, and a reduction in annual average phosphorus from 9.5 to 9.4 parts per billion. Again, it seems like a small amount, but it is important when we're dealing with an uncertain and risky future scenario. We do expect that the bloom risk does not decline from 40%. There's no change in this business as usual plus LID scenario. So we've assessed the impact of the positive impact of this kind of strategy that does not add a lot of cost to new development, and seen that the benefit, while small, is still significant. We also looked at some other potential regulatory changes to assess their possible impact. I'm going to talk about septic system standards within the lake. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, that 36-inch septic standard is a key development constraint. And just to look quickly at what the regulation actually says within the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Overlay District, subsurface areas shall not be permitted on sites where the highest seasonal groundwater table, bedrock, or other impervious layer is less than 36 inches below the bottom of the organic horizon. The organic horizon is that thin layer at the top of a soil profile where soil changes in predictable ways going from the surface downward to bedrock. So from the bottom of that organic horizon down to bedrock or another restrictive layer, such as a clay layer or the top of the water table, cannot be less than 36 inches. That standard also incorporates a requirement that the distance from the bottom of the organic horizon to the bottom of the subsurface absorption area, or the leach field, can only be 12 inches. So it's a 12-inch increment near the soil surface. And then the not less than 24 inches of suitable soil shall be present below the bottom of the subsurface absorption area. So there's a couple of important points here. The vertical separation from your leach bed down to bedrock or the water table or a restrictive layer is very important for filtering out pathogens. But the most important areas for treating phosphorus are the most reactive layers of the soil. By reactive, I mean fine-grained particles in soil like clays, which, while not allowing water to percolate through as quickly, soils that are heavy in clay are very reactive. Parts of the soil that are heavy in organic matter are also very reactive. So they provide lots of sites for phosphorus to bind and not move quickly through the soil profile and not reach receiving water bodies very quickly. So that's really important to point out that this set of restrictions applies to soils that are already in situ, that are in place. There's no allowance here for importing fill or building up mounded systems, which are allowed elsewhere in Maine. I apologize for the small type here. This table reviews septic standards in various New England states. And the key point here is that for many years, Maine's restrictions at the state level on septic systems have been much less restrictive than other states in New England. In 2015, these restrictions were revised. The vertical separation, that distance from the bottom of the leach bed to the restrictive layer, was increased. Before, when it was 9 to 15 inches, that was by far the least restrictive in New England. Now there's a tiered system for from 12 to 48 inches of vertical separation. So that is still on the less restrictive end of New England regulations. But it's important to point out that the septic standard within the Lake Auburn Watershed District overlay is much more restrictive because in the Maine state regulations, importing fill and building mounded systems and other alternatives is allowed. It's also important to recognize that this development constraint is holding back development of new buildings within the watershed. We estimated that if the standard were removed completely and reverted to Maine state standards, an additional 88 new buildings would be possible to be added to the business as usual scenario. Of course, that removal of that restriction was also incorporated in the maximum development scenario. But just to isolate that impact, that's 88 new buildings within city limits. So while the septic standard was in the watershed was designed to limit the supply of pathogens and nutrients like phosphorus to the lake, and removing it would be a significant impact of new buildings. We argue that if the standard is to be changed, it should be changed to allow innovation for improved phosphorus removal. It should be changed to allow use of the B horizon and up for infiltration, to allow the full extent of the reactive soil profile to do its work and remove phosphorus, or allow use of drip irrigation technology and which can be constructed very close to the surface and can take full advantage of those native soils at the top that are very reactive. There are many different alternative designs that are being tested. Massachusetts is a leader on testing new designs, particularly for phosphorus removal capability. The idea is to improve reactivity of the matrix that water from the leach field is percolating through by use of iron and aluminum and other reactive metals to enhance those reactions. So we recommend that the competing use of septic systems to remove both pathogens and phosphorus should be considered here. and that vertical separation should be maintained, but that innovative new uses can be allowed to improve phosphorus removal. At the same time, the increased number of buildings should be considered, and the effect of removing this development constraint should be counteracted if at all possible. And so that leads me to making some recommendations that are holistic, looking at the phosphorus problem in the watershed as a whole, and then some more specific policy recommendations that might be able to achieve some of these goals. First, we looked at scenarios of future development. When all development was removed from the equation there, and the effect of the alum treatment was still incorporated, the total phosphorus levels did not appreciably increase just with the effects of increased temperature and precipitation alone. So the impacts of climate change did not alone push the lake to higher levels of phosphorus. So losing the filtration waiver is not inevitable, but it's important to set a clear community goal around the water quality that the community intends to achieve. If keeping the filtration waiver is part of that, then so be it. It will be protective of water quality for other key thresholds, but the filtration waiver threshold is not the most important one, nor is it the first one that will be reached. Indeed, the 10 parts per billion phosphorus threshold has been crossed at various points in the most recent decade, and the 75% forested threshold within the watershed is also the threshold that Lake Auburn finds itself on currently. So recommendations to pull back from those thresholds are, first, to incentivize preserving and regrowing forest wherever possible. This includes incorporation of low-impact development techniques to limit new conversion, but regrowing forest is also going to be an important part of this equation. And of course, regardless of whether a filtration plant gets built or not, the community should plan to continue watershed protection and in-lake treatment as currently constituted. As we've shown, without, even incorporating the effects of alum treatment, the lake is going to feel the effects of those future build-out scenarios. Agriculture has an outsized impact on phosphorus loading. An important implication of our modeling is that removal of agriculture for the purposes of development was actually counteracting some of the additional phosphorus load from that development for residential purposes. And agriculture is a part of the way of life in this community and across Maine. It's very difficult to find ways to effectively balance that land use with water supply, but incentivizing new agriculture elsewhere in Auburn is one way to encourage the continued development of local agriculture without prioritizing it within the watershed itself. And we recommend also that supporting farmers to work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service to improve existing practices is going to achieve some benefit from the existing agriculture in the watershed. The implication of our modeling of the low-impact development techniques suggests that without the participation of the upper watershed towns, Auburn alone won't achieve enough load reduction to really remove itself from the risk of frequent algal blooms. So, of course, we recommend that working with the upper watershed towns to implement low-impact development there and to continue to prioritize watershed protection in those upper watershed towns and keep forest wherever possible is going to serve the lake well in the long run. So those are the holistic recommendations, and I'll go into some specific policy and ordinance recommendations. First, adopting the revised watershed boundary just represents the physical reality of the lake. Second, I touched on swimming, but if a swimming beach is developed, we recommend the following restrictions. First, ensure that all control practices or erosion control practices are adequately monitored and maintained for pre-construction, during construction, post-construction, for the lifetime of the beach itself. We recommend limiting use of it to city residents and limiting the capacity to 50. We also recommend a designated swimming area with roped off with buoys to make very clear that there is one designated swimming area. We recommend that, we encourage paid participation in the form of stickers that will ensure funding for adequate monitoring, both in terms of the erosion control practices and in terms of beach water quality monitoring. Fecal indicator bacteria are a very common and very effective way of monitoring the risk of water quality impairment at beaches. And in the context of keeping those restrictions, we do not recommend that swimming from boats is allowed. Only in a very limited geographic area, well away from the Auburn Water District intake. And third, if the 36-inch septic standard is to be removed, we recommend keeping that vertical separation requirement, which is the most effective means of ensuring that pathogens are removed from wastewater from septic systems. And we recommend allowing alternative designs that make use of those reactive soil horizons or use innovative designs to artificially increase phosphorus retention within those systems. And with that, that concludes the presentation. Myself and our team who are joining remotely would be happy to answer questions and engage in discussion on these results.
Well,
Thank you for your attention.
No, first of all, thank you and the team for probably putting together one of the most comprehensive and balanced studies that I've seen in my time as mayor and in the business world prior. So thank you for the time and dedication. I'm sure the council has a lot of questions. I also want to be cognizant that Councilor Boss is joining remotely via Zoom. If I could see her up on the screen as well as the other participants, that would be great. What I'd like to do is start off with a round of questions. I'll start with Katie because she's remote. And just question per counselor first until everybody has a turn to ask a question, if you have one. So Councilor Boss.
Thank you, and thank you again for the presentation. This is great information. My first question, I have a couple of them, but I'll do one. With what regularity can we apply alum, and is there any threshold at which applying alum year after year would become detrimental to water quality?
So several studies have looked at the feasibility of continuing alum treatment. We used a 10-year interval as a model that was in discussion with Dr. Ken Wagner, who advised the original CDM Smith study of the feasibility of alum treatment. It's based upon several factors, the most important of which is the rate at which the lake water is refreshed, which is on the order of 4 to 5 years. And the considerations that go into reducing the risk of alum treatment involve adequate pH buffering so that the addition of aluminum sulfate does not cause a decrease in pH. So we're modeling a 10-year interval. It's important also to note that the 2019 alum treatment was a partial application. Despite it being a partial application that didn't cover the entire geographic area of the lake, it did achieve the goal of substantial reduction of phosphorus load. So we're going forward in our model, we were not assuming a need for an increase in the dosage or the geographic coverage of that alum treatment.
But you project that it could be applied every 10 years through the year 2100 without adverse impacts?
Yes. Councilor Zania?
Thank you. I also want to echo that this has been a really thorny situation for a long time here, and this presentation, I think, shows us a way forward, finally, that we didn't have. Obviously, a lot of work needs to be done, a lot of nuances in the way things are integrated and affect one another. So one of the things I wanted to ask, and I'm not asking you to give this to us now, but can you provide us a list of the data and research that you use to come up with your conclusions?
Yes, I failed to mention near the top, and I very much should have, that this is a presentation of results, not the comprehensive report that we're preparing, that is forthcoming in July. That will contain a full enumeration of the data sources that we used for both raw water quality and data, and the sources of assumptions and other studies that we reviewed in the setup and execution of the model. So that report will be more comprehensive. I tried to keep it only to the essentials, and it was a challenge to pack enough information in here to explain context, but I hope that it was illustrative of the depth and breadth of work that's gone into this.
You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to keep, Councilor McLeod, you got anything right now?
I'm still thinking.
We'll come back. We'll just keep going around and around. You're not, I mean, we've already paid them, so it's not per hour anymore, right? We're good? Okay. Just got to always have to ask, right?
And we saved a lot of travel time by having our team remotely. I want to make sure that they get a chance to weigh in on any questions as well.
Absolutely. And I believe, are they on right now? Are they able to weigh in? Brian, if you can
I
check.
can only see the counselor in the Zoom window.
Okay, we'll bring, they might be waiting, so we're going to bring the rest of them in too. In the meantime, in your scenarios, in your modeling, and I know modeling is exciting and there's probably 1,000 different permutations of the models that can be run, of course, and I do appreciate the ones you chose. Looking back, and I really want to highlight the surrounding towns and a couple points of massive growth, obviously percentage-wise, increase in Turner, Minot, Buckfield, and those three towns, Hebron as well, I believe, compared to the growth in Auburn, both in the business as usual and the maximum development areas. Their growth has outpaced us as a percentage, correct, over the last 23 years? Is that why we're projecting such a higher percentage growth in those areas than in Auburn?
The results in terms of overall magnitude of the growth are primarily a result of the looser development constraints within those towns. The condition of full build-out was modeled separately for each of the towns, but the 2188 figure that I referenced was just for Auburn.
I see.
Now we did prorate, so to speak, the development rates for the other towns, and it was all based on that land use change analysis, which included a count of existing buildings in 1997, 2010, and 2020. So using those growth rates from the last approximately 24 years.
Okay, so the question on that, thanks for the clarity. If looking back at a modeling scenario in which the development standards that currently exist within the Auburn municipal boundaries of the watershed were equally applied to the outlying towns going back 30, 40, 50 years, did you model that out? Or if not, can you give us some sort of colloquial or analogy that our lake would be significantly better now? It does seem like there's a double standard put into place based upon municipal boundaries versus science.
Yes, so we looked at several permutations of removing all development within the watershed, development only in Auburn itself, and removing upper watershed town development and keeping Auburn development itself. The biggest effect counteracting the impact of the upper watershed town's growth was their distance from Lake Auburn as a receiving water, and the fact that phosphorus load from Turner and the other upper watershed towns was first received by Little Wilson Pond and then the basin. So the impact of these upper watershed water bodies was providing significant attenuation of the phosphorus load from those upper watershed towns. There's no way around the fact that the contribution of new load from development in the upper watershed towns dwarfs or is much more significant than the overall number of new buildings in Auburn. But they benefit, and Lake Auburn benefits from the fact that they're geographically at a remove and they have these intermediate receiving water bodies. That's another important assumption of our study, is that the attenuation in those upper watershed water bodies, Little Wilson Pond and the basin, remains at what it is currently. 50% of the incoming phosphorus load is attenuated. That could change. That's another source of that uncertainty in the model. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but that's the biggest source of defraying the impact of those upper watershed towns, and it's uncertain whether it will continue.
Very good, thank you. I'll keep going around. Any other counselors to my right have any questions?
Yeah.
Counselor Milks?
With regards to septic systems and modern septic systems versus, you talked about that top layer being the most effective at reducing phosphorus leaching
Yes.
into the, does the raising of, having put several septic systems in, not myself, but somebody else I paid.
Yep.
It's with certain soil levels at different areas, they have to raise the system above. So is that effective in this scenario? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, it's effective for achieving the vertical separation between the receiving groundwater or the bedrock or other restrictive layer. So it is very effective at removing pathogens, filtering out bacteria, filtering out viruses. The method, I actually live in a home with a mounded septic system in Pownell, and that the construction of those mounded systems is such that they want to increase percolation, increase the rate at which water moves downward by using a medium of sand at the place where the leach bed is receiving the leachate, and then it's able to percolate without mounding up within the system itself, without the groundwater mounding within the leach bed mound. What it's not as effective at doing, because of that less reactive sand media, and I'm not a licensed site evaluator or a septic system designer myself, so this is a layman speaking, but it's more effective at removing bacteria, but less effective at removing phosphorus because it's not a reactive medium. That's why research is being done in Massachusetts and other places at providing a more reactive medium that also allows for sufficient percolation downward, so that you actually balance the needs for pathogen removal with the need for phosphorus removal.
One more quick. And just also on a lot of these economic assumptions, was there any basis on the apportionment between Lewiston and Auburn on costs, or was it based on 50-50?
We didn't. I touched on this briefly in the slide summing up the economic benefit, and I can just quickly pull that up again. But it was something that we didn't factor in because it would have required a large assumption of increasing projecting the existing cost-sharing relationship. Many costs have been split 50-50 between Lewiston and Auburn. It's unclear in these future scenarios whether that would continue at 50-50. Certainly if we applied a 50% reduction in the impact of the costs of filtration, it would greatly enhance the net economic impact. The benefit to Auburn would be greater if 50% of the costs were removed, but the entire balance of the potential tax revenues were continue to be captured
So
by
the
Auburn.
cost of filtration in this study was based on Auburn assuming 100% of the cost?
Or all costs are 100%.
The net economic benefit, and this slide is not popping up because we've got the Zoom active, but the net economic benefit value here is assuming that Auburn is covering all costs of filtration. But you could easily apply that 50% cost sharing and go from a net economic impact of 3.5 million to a much more significant. So it would be 50% of the capital cost of 1.6 million, 50% of the 1 million annual plant operations and maintenance costs, 50% of the financing costs, and the net economic benefit would start to look a lot better, of course.
Okay.
Yep.
So just if we could make sure that in the final copy of the report that we do have a footnote just annotating that assumption, that'd be great.
Sure.
Thank you for the clarity. Councilor Gary?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, thank you for this excellent report. I look forward to their full report in July. But could we also get a summary report that's not quite as big as the full report so that we can refer back when we try to make decisions?
Yes, I as a matter of course, will include an executive summary to the report as front matter, which summarizes the main conclusions, and will be packaged for the public to be able to read and understand quickly.
Thank you. And then on these other towns that empty into
Councilor
the...
Gary, if we could just, I do want to do one at a time, one question at a time if I could.
Some people were allowed to ask 2 questions.
Yeah,
Was Steve too? Okay, I'll let it slide. I limited Councilor Boss to 1 now, so thank you.
okay, given the fact that all these towns empty into the Little Wilson Pond, is there a way that we could possibly, or would it work to filter the water before it gets into Lake Auburn to try to get rid of some of the phosphorus and other contaminants?
Yes, and that's certainly a strategy that would be effective at limiting the incoming phosphorus load. The in-lake treatment would be much more cost-effective than actually designing and constructing filtration for the output of Little Wilson or the basin into Lake Auburn. And there has been quite a bit of activity in watershed protection and retrofitting of existing development within those watersheds to limit the amount of incoming phosphorus in the first place.
Thank you.
And now Councilor Walker.
Yeah, just one question. How would you recommend that we work closer or better with the surrounding towns, like Turner, for instance?
That's a great question, and probably one more suited for a social scientist than a natural scientist like myself. I will say that the mechanisms for intermunicipality cooperation already exist. The Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission is a board with 1 member from each of the upper watershed towns. In some of our conversations with stakeholders and in gathering information for this study, we encountered the perception that the upper watershed towns don't take watershed protection as seriously. I can't speak to that condition, not having witnessed it myself, but the potential for cooperating in existing channels is definitely there. The willpower and the re-energization of those existing channels may be the issue there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Councilor Carrier.
Gonna try this. The counselor had talked to you about the filtration of the water coming in. Would it benefit us to alum treat the water something less costly, or would the water turnover coming through those areas be too much?
A couple of thoughts on that question of whether alum treatment in the upper watershed water bodies would be effective. First, feasibility and background water quality testing and really understanding the system need to be done for years in preparation for an alum treatment in order to safely apply the right dosage. In previous decades, before techniques were really honed to buffer pH to avoid aluminum toxicity, there were many instances where alum treatments caused toxicity and had deleterious impacts to aquatic life. So it wouldn't be as simple as going right ahead and doing it with Little Wilson Pond or the basin. Lake Auburn is much better studied. There's much more effort into monitoring and characterizing water quality over the long term. And there's quite an adequate data set for doing the kind of work that we've been doing. Not so with Little Wilson Pond and the basin, but treating the water at the source of its intake is very likely the most cost-effective means, notwithstanding the potential impacts of acting without enough information on those upper watershed towns.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to Councilor Boss. Councilor Boss?
Thank you. Can cyanobacteria be filtered?
That's a great question. The dead or decaying or live bodies of cyanobacteria cells can easily be filtered. The issue is the toxic byproducts that they can sometimes produce from their metabolism, microcystin and other organic contaminants that can actually leave the algal cell itself, or the cyanobacterial cell itself, and be present, dissolved in the water. Filtration for those toxins requires a filtration system that can handle organic contaminants. Conventional sand or multimedia filters can't handle organic contaminants with reliable results, but carbon filtration can. So there are comparable systems of comparable size out there. The Kennebec Water District serving Waterville and surrounding areas is one example. Massabesic Lake, the water source for Manchester, New Hampshire, is another comparable. And the capital costs are not significantly different, but granular activated carbon carries a significant replacement cost that needs to be done on the order of every 10 to 20 years. So it's comparable in many ways to the other filtration technologies, but it can achieve removal of those cyanobacteria toxins.
Thank you.
Councilor Zani?
Thank you. You mentioned about runoff of, I'm going to, hard surfaces, hardscaping, whatever that is, driveways
Yes,
and things like that.
impervious surfaces, yes.
What did you, impervious surfaces,
Yes.
thank you. So did you do a survey of kind of the total amount of impervious surfaces, and is that something that we could address sooner rather than later?
So the land use analysis that we did was not a direct count of impervious surfaces. Though data sets like that do exist, they're somewhat less reliable than taking a larger scale look at different modes of development and then assigning an average value of impervious cover that's associated with residential development, with agricultural land use, with different densities of mixed use, residential, commercial, industrial. So it does incorporate the impervious cover within the land use category. So it achieves a look at impervious cover and also lawns, which behave very differently from forested cover in how they respond to precipitation and how they channel water to either runoff or infiltration into groundwater. So we did incorporate that into the analysis, but indirectly.
Thank you.
Councilor McLeod? Have you
Thank you.
thought enough?
Yes.
Good.
So you showed both scenarios, the absolute worst case scenario, if we let everything happen, and then if we keep business as usual. In the report that you're going to present, will that also have some of the other variables that were in there? For example, if we left the watershed protection area alone, undeveloped, but everything else happened, are there gradients to allow us to see what other things can happen in that in-between area?
Yes.
Okay.
As with any model, the more effort you put into it, the more results you get out of it. And of course, we did look at those specific changes. So if you manipulate 5 different variables, well, then how can you back out the effect of any given variable? We've done some of that already in terms of looking at the effect of taking out the septic, taking out the removal of the 36-inch septic standard and seeing what the impact of number of new buildings would be precisely on that variable. So we will do that in the report. Maybe not quite to the level of specificity of considering each and every variable on its own with a new model run, because of the effort that would be involved in modeling every conceivable scenario. But we do understand the need to consider these things piece by piece rather than as a whole of a scenario that was put together with multiple changes.
Perfect, thank you.
I'm just going to let the council ask a couple more questions. I'll just wrap up everything before we end your presentation. We're coming up to 2 hours. So last questions if we could. I'll come around and make sure we get last. Councilor Milks?
Did you identify particular areas in runoff seems to be one of the major things that cause the problems and contamination in the lake? Have you identified specific areas that have the heaviest runoff? And are there ways you can mitigate that with man-made engineering holding, diverting that runoff?
Yes, so in the maps of land use and land cover, it's not hard to pick out the areas of densest development. Most of them are on the southern side of the lake, particularly closer to Outlet Beach, and that's where development is most dense. Some of this work has already been done in disconnecting impervious surfaces where before they might have been diverted directly to a creek, a tributary to the lake, or directly to the lake itself. Many of these have already been identified over preceding decades and disconnected those impervious surfaces from receiving waters to enhance infiltration artificially. With the use of things like infiltration basins, which is a version of the infiltration trench I showed you, but much larger, for things like parking lots or roadways with multiple lanes of traffic where volumes generated of rainwater coming off of those things are actually quite large. So some of that low-hanging fruit in terms of retrofitting the impervious surfaces has already been done, and was identified in a pretty comprehensive way by the CDM Smith study back in 2013 and 2014. There are probably some low-hanging fruit that could still be addressed.
Thank you.
Go around questions?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
please. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Given that there's all different sources of water types, like some lakes get their water, drinking water from other lakes emptying into them. From what I understand, with Lake Auburn, it's more spring-fed versus water running into it. Is that a plus or minus, or could that potentially be a detriment?
I wish I had the figure for contributions from groundwater and surface water in front of me so I could give you a direct comparison. And I'm looking into cyberspace there, and I don't see one of our team members who might be able to look that up. But they're both significant proportions, and surface waters in general are going to reflect the influence of developed land use around them because of the simple fact that more of the water that they're carrying hasn't infiltrated, hasn't been filtered through groundwater, has directly flown over the land surface, whether it's encountered trees or lawns or roadways along its way. So concentrations, levels of phosphorus in the surface waters are generally going to be higher than they are in groundwater, with the exception of certain situations where you have a high intensity phosphorus concentration infiltrating into groundwater. Things like that can happen around animal feeding operations. Animal waste lagoons can be a source, though generally they're pretty impermeable. But those kinds of exceptions to that rule can exist. I can't speak with specificity to where those things might be on the landscape, but the Water District and the Watershed Protection Commission have looked pretty carefully at some of those types of high density sources of phosphorus.
Thank you.
Councilor Walker, Councilor, question?
Yeah, another question for you, or at least looking for an answer. You talked about the beach area, and you said you'd like to get us limit it to 50 people. Are you talking 50 people once a day, 50 people once an hour?
Talking a capacity limit, so no more than 50 occupants at a time.
Okay, say we had, well, just 100 people there, but only 50 people are using the water. Does that matter?
Yeah, it does matter. It would be on the basis of admittance, because you get yourself into a very difficult situation to regulate if you're allowing more people just sort of onlookers rather than swimmers. So that would be the idea would be to minimize the regulatory headache with as simple of regulation as possible.
So if we disagreed and said we want 75 people, is that breaking somebody's big rule, or?
It's not going to hurt our feelings in terms of a recommendation, and it's a guideline that we've assembled from feasibility studies of other lakes and other beach questions like this, keeping it to a manageable basis for starters, and not seeing any negative impacts would be one way to test the concept.
Thank you.
Councilor, yeah, of course.
Along the same lines, did you look at, we're looking at the entire lake as versus the outlet, since that water doesn't flow back?
Yes, we weren't looking at Outlet Beach at all with the feasibility. Outlet Beach, as you're correct to point out, doesn't flow back into Lake Auburn. It's an outlet with very shallow water with very little circulation. So I know that the city has looked at this carefully. Swimming in Outlet Beach wouldn't have any direct impact on Lake Auburn itself, but it would require significant upgrades to the water there in order to make it self-sustaining, good water quality.
Before we go into some final questions, I just want to open this up to the rest of your team, Rick. Do they have any comments? And then I just want maybe a couple last questions. And to the council, what we'll do is we'll gather questions after I digest the full report. And I think a lot of our answers will be in that too. Put them together, then we'll have the city manager send those questions as a follow-up email, go over them in council meeting. But right now, Rick, would you like to just turn this over to them? If they have any, if not, that's fine.
Sure. Out there in cyberspace, we have Dr. Dagno and Forrest Bell from our team. And Eric Cousins is here as well, joining remotely, who's been instrumental with guidance and support for the study. So I wanted to make sure I acknowledged him first.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, sure. I'll just speak really quickly and say, I just wanted to recognize the team again. Rich and Laura from my company, and Adam and Ellie Baker from Horsley Witten Group. They've basically been living Lake Auburn and this project for the last 5 months. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a very intense project, timeline-wise, and they've really stayed up late a lot of nights and worked a lot of weekends. And then, Rich just mentioned Eric and also Phil. I mean, Eric has been part of our team, an active part of our team, guiding us the whole way. And We work with a lot of municipalities, but this was a very high end as far as how much participation we got from city staff. And I just wanted to make sure that the mayor and the council know that. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank Rich for doing such a great job at speaking on all our behalf. You did awesome and sound like an economist now, Rich. So maybe my job is done. I also want to thank the council for all of your questions. Many of the ones that you raised were ones that we raised ourselves sort of during the process. So it's also great to see that type of engagement, that level of depth that you guys are asking. And hopefully once you get the sort of full outline of the report, even more of your questions will be answered.
Rich, good? Anybody else? That's good. So last questions, if I could, Councilor Boss, you had one more, and then if there's another pertinent question, we'll get that taken care of.
Thank you. My last question is on the annualized economic impact table in the slides presented earlier. Are those representing just primary economic impacts, or do they also represent secondary and tertiary?
Adam had mentioned that I might be taking away his job, but I think your job is safe, Adam. I'm definitely going to defer this one to you.
Yeah, so these are primarily primary impacts. We're not necessarily looking at the flow-on effects. So particularly when we talked about sort of benefits from swimming, trail recreation, boating, and fishing, it's sort of the value that people are going to derive from taking the time, effort, energy to actually go and recreate and do that activity, but not necessarily the flow-on effects that if they go and buying a new bicycle or swim gear or going to a restaurant or anything like that.
And just a follow on, is there any reason that we're looking just at primary, or is it too difficult to project out secondary? I think just in the context of our initiative to increase sports tourism and that kind of economic activity.
Yeah, we don't really have the numbers to know sort of what the flow on could be. Yeah. Roughly, if you wanted to guess, you could say multiply those numbers by 2. But again, it's going to that next level of depth is hard to do, particularly because we're really uncertain of what the numbers would be in terms of really, I came up with the likely range of recreators, but before I wanted to go, I want to be comfortable enough about primary before I then try to think about what the spillover effects will be as well. Yeah, hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you. Councilor Zani?
Yep, just quickly. So are models included of the low impact development in the full report so that we have some sort of things to go by as we move forward?
Yes.
Thank you.
Also in the report, is there going to be a gradient of recreation activities as part of that modeling, such as ice fishing or stuff like that?
Not so much a gradient per se, but the effects on recreation of the two future scenarios are considered closely. It's sort of an all or nothing assumption of the effect rather than trying to estimate a gradient of different effects on the recreational value.
Thank you.
Councilor Milks? Gary, any last parting questions? Yes, Councilor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to allow my time to Sid Hazelton if there's a question he would like to ask.
I'm sorry, Councilor Gary, we're not ceding time at this point. It's just a council workshop. Any follow-up questions from staff or the public we want to be able to take, but we want to make sure that we have the entire study first. So this is for us here at this point in the workshop, as per normal. Councilor Walker?
One more question. If we was to build a filtration building or whatever it takes for that lake in 10 years, if we could do that, would this save a lot of future problems going to the 2100?
I would, in answer to that, I would say it's always best to plan ahead for future needs. The value of us projecting the impacts on the lake itself from these development scenarios is to give some guideposts to know what the future planning possibilities are. But planning to build a plant in 10 years to handle water quality at that point in 10 years isn't going to do anything for the lake. It's going to do something for the consumers of the water that is treated. And it could be that it would head off an emergency situation where an adverse water quality impact would be happening, and the water district and the city and all stakeholders would need to come up with a solution in an emergency scenario. So it certainly could solve certain problems, but it might be an unnecessary cost being accrued in a situation where it's not needed.
I think Brian, he just showed me costs. Would the cost be a big difference now than waiting like you showed on the slide?
So it's really notoriously difficult to project construction and labor costs into the future. Once again, Adam's job security is safe in being able to explain the science of projecting these things. But as someone who personally is experiencing the fluctuations of building materials and labor, building my own home right now, I can say that it's an inexact science at best, which is not a simple exercise of projecting, sort of linear increases. It really depends on a lot of economic factors.
Thank you.
And Councilor Carey, that was your question. I'm going to turn this back over to Phil, our city manager. We'll wrap this up, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Rich, great job in the presentation. I just want to thank you and your team for the work that you did over these last 5 months. As Rich shared, Eric was very much part of those initial and ongoing weekly touch basing of a process so that we were directly involved. But if council and the public remembers, this work began back with a work group that was comprised of a team to draft the RFP to be able to get a report that we received today. And so I really want to thank Councilor Gary and Councilor Carrier, as well in the audience. We have Jason Paulina, Mary Sylvester was part of that, as well as Sid Hazelton, and Derek Belanger, and Eric Cousins, and Councilor Titus, former Councilor Titus. And so the work that they did on drafting that RFP was able to ensure that we had the quality of presentation that we received today, and it really did start with that RFP drafting. So, but great results. There's more to come, as Rich had said, and so we will communicate more as you provide our feedback to make sure that that's implemented in part of their final report.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just some parting thoughts for the council and for the city as a whole. Listening to everything, kind of absorbing the council's questions, obviously your data and the science backing it, and not to sound too melodramatic, though I have a tendency to, I do believe this is a dawn of a new era in Auburn, where we actually have actionable data that we can then use to influence the future of our city and help build something that's economically sustainable, ecologically sound, also has recreational opportunities for all of our residents, current and the ones yet to be born. We're looking that far out in the future, and rarely in municipal government, I think, do we have that level and depth of data to make smart, educated decisions based upon simulated results. So I want to thank you all again for that. I will say that the timing on this is critical. I'm going to ask a comprehensive plan review committee to take a step back on the future land use proposals that they have coming to council, and maybe take a pause. Councilor McLeod is on that subcommittee with me, and take a couple-week hiatus on that in order to digest the full report and then make some recommendations in this 10-year plan based upon some of that data. Councilor McLeod, in agreement on that one? Yeah, I think it might be smart to pause that for a bit. And then recreation, I think that I'd like to ask staff here, the Lewis and Auburn Watershed Protection Commission, as well the Auburn Water District, chaired by Councilor Milks, to really start looking at the recreational ability and feasibility of a smart pilot program that can actually start, for the first time in 100 years, our residents to legally swim within Lake Auburn. Not to say anybody has done it illegally, but I've heard rumors. So I think we have a lot of work in a short amount of time. Thank you. Love to have a copy of your PowerPoint, and we look forward to the full written report out in July. In the meantime, we'll be in communication with follow-up questions based upon the full report, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of them. So we'll let this all percolate for the next week or so. Okay? Thank you all very much. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to call this workshop in recess for 10 minutes before we have other work to address. Thank you. we're not going to dwell on too many things. And we're
Ron?
I'd like to welcome everybody back from break in the workshop. Next up on the agenda tonight, we have a presentation from the city manager and myself on the American Rescue Plan, potential uses for the revenue that's coming in. We told you about a month ago that staff and I would be working on presenting some ideas and intelligence to you, and this is what we have. So I'll turn over to Phil.
Thanks, Mayor, Council. With us is also Rita Bodary, our grant manager. Rita's been part of getting us prepared and having already received our 50% of the ARPA funds that are coming to Auburn, and she's here to certainly answer questions. There's a lot of reporting that has to take place with these funds, even prior to us spending the first penny. Reporting will need to take place. So Liz is going to be steering our presentation. So Liz, go ahead and advance the slide. So obviously this is a historic intervention. It's once in a generation type of opportunity here. When you take a look at the funds that'll be coming through. This started March 11, 2021. It's the first time really that all municipal governments will be entitled to a direct, non-competitive federal formula grant by the U.S. Treasurer. I think that means a lot, and that does demonstrate that the importance behind this initiative and why we need to ensure that we are, one, staying within the guidelines of the U.S. Treasury Department. We're getting revised guidelines, and we're reviewing those, and we're maintaining our due diligence in ensuring what will be the parameters on these expenditures. But this direct funding means that this aid is for municipalities and is protected from any state interference. So there's no regulation that comes from the state on these direct entitlements. This will be directly allocated to you as a governing body to decide how you would like to spend these dollars. Liz, go ahead and move on to this. So Auburn's funding allocation was $13,545,799. 50% of that has been deposited, and we have currently available. And then the remainder will be deposited next year. That's the way the U.S. Treasurer determined how those funds will be distributed to municipalities. Our deadline to obligate these funds is June 30th of 2024. So there is no rush per se to spend this $14 million, nearly $14 million immediately. There's an opportunity to really evaluate and then also take a look at what else is coming. The other pieces of the American Relief Fund dollars is actually going to other federal entities allocated through other grants. And so we're going to be paying attention to those, and we're going to be monitoring how can we leverage, potentially, we'll bring before you, opportunities to leverage our dollars with some other grants that we can be applying for. So Rita has dialed into those. We'll be monitoring those. We'll see what's available. We're also in close communication with our congressional representatives as they are very much aware of these opportunities when they become available. Eligible expenditures, really it's responding to the public health emergency as it pertains to COVID. How you word that, how you can address that is really up to the community. But you can see here just with just the public health emergency component, you can reference whether we're assisting with households, small businesses, nonprofits, aid to impacted industries such as the tourism, travel, and hospitality. And it's no more restricted than what the CARES Act Relief Fund had available. Also respond to workers performing essential work. There's opportunities there where you can allocate funds for those who did perform that essential work. They put guidelines in on what you can be able to provide for them per employee that a municipality may allocate. Go ahead, Liz. In addition, when it comes to the COVID, I believe that this is really regarding non-entitlement. So we're an entitlement community, so I'm going to move on to the next one. But to make necessary investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. That is, there's some guidance that's along with that from the Treasury Department, and we'll continue the, currently, it's about a 150-page document, plus now there's a new, close to 60 pages, I think, that came out with some revisions. So we'll continue monitoring that, we'll continue taking a look at it. As we move forward, we'll have a better handle for you on this is what we can move forward with, and this is what we might have some challenges on. But infrastructure is key. So regulatory requirements, permissions, so those within the government agencies like Auburn, you can transfer your funds. Some of that can go to a nonprofit organization that might be providing the type of service that you're needing to deliver for the community. A public benefit corporation could be involved in transportation of passengers. Special purpose unit of a state or a local government. So how could you then work within another entity that's providing those types of services? There's no restrictions on local governments prohibiting tax cuts or local stimulus payments. So that's an opportunity that's also available and what that would look like. Obviously, you know, remember, some of this regulation and the regulatory requirements, you got to think about Auburn received 14 million. You have others that received well over 100 million. So sometimes when we look at some of these regulatories, we'd wonder, well, how could that possibly take place? Well, there's some communities that are receiving a great deal of funds that they could easily take a certain portion and return it back to citizens in a check. Question that you'd have to weigh out is that really going to be impactful as you move forward? Go ahead.
Just a quick question. When you talk, on the previous slide, when you talk about distribution to other organizations and nonprofits, do they have to be in the city of Auburn, or?
They would have to provide the service in Auburn.
They'd have to provide a service. in-
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Other regulatory, small cities, they cannot receive more than 75%. That doesn't pertain to us. Grant monies can't be used for any pension funds, and then the state governments are prohibited from spending or replacing revenue declines, enacted since the March 3rd, 2021. So those are, and then obviously any other current laws that are in place, we'll need to make sure we are following. And this is where I talked about the periodic reporting. I think our first report reader is due in August.
It is.
So those will be regular reports moving forward. So the first report's coming right up. Obviously, there's nothing that we're going to be reporting on other than that fact that we received half of the funds. Go ahead, Liz. One thing that we did in talking with the mayor was, what's our regional strategy? What should we be looking at as a regional approach to the funds that are coming in? So we did hold a ARPA summit, which was on June 3rd. And the intent here was to at least bring to the table the city of Lewiston, the manager, and we invited the mayor, but we had a councilor that arrived, participated, as well as a commissioner from Androscoggin County and the county administrator. We had AvCog representation, the Lewiston Auburn Metro Chamber, Central Maine Community College, and University of Southern Maine. Purpose for those two invites is because they are also receiving ARPA funds through other means. However, they are receiving dollars. And so the intent here is how can we leverage this entire group if there are any regional strategies, and to know what those regional strategies might be so then we can bring them back to you. The entities from the city of Lewiston and Androscoggin County, part of our task was to go back to our representatives, talk about the fact that we had a regional strategy, and I'll talk about some of where that group landed on priorities. And it doesn't mean that, you know, we're collaborating with a certain amount of dollars. It could be that as a region, we're moving forward in a direction as it pertains to, say, housing or workforce development. And as a region, we're moving in that direction. Each community may be allocating their own dollars to meet that. But it also doesn't mean that you can't collaborate with dollars on a specific project as well. So we've lost our connection here. There we go. So one thing that came out from that discussion was this Elm Tree And I thought it was really good. It came from Ben Tucker, who, I'm sorry, I didn't mention, but we had representatives from all three, Congressman Golden's office, Senator Collins, and Senator King. And Ben Tucker was there, and he talked about the fact that if you think about some communities over 100 years ago that took a look at their Main Street, and they planted elm trees. And they did that knowing that they would not necessarily see that investment that they had made. However, that investment that they were made was going to impact future generations. And I thought that was, I think everyone there had kind of keyed in on that's the type of investment that this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity is going to provide us as a community. And now how do we leverage that? Go ahead, Liz, to the next one. So the Summit Regional Focus Area was really focusing on housing, workforce, transportation, childcare, and some type of food processing center were the key areas that came from that group. The group is going to come back to the table again in a future meeting to talk about feedback that they've received from their representatives. We'll come back and then we'll talk further about this. We have started reaching out to organizations that we feel tie into some of these key areas. The mayor and I have met with the executive director for Good Shepherd Food Bank, and we also met with, who wasn't able to participate because of schedule, the interim president for Central Maine Community College, Betsy Levy, as we were talking about the workforce development piece. So we've really had some really good conversations, and then I've also spoken with Betsy Norcross-Plord, who's the executive director for Promise Early Education, who will be at our next summit to talk about childcare. And as we talk about workforce, as we talk about workforce housing, as we talk about growth, childcare has to be at that table as well, so that we can talk about what we're providing as a community to ensure that we have a strong workforce. Go ahead, Liz. Mayor?
Yeah. So here's some quick bullet points. We're going to go in and talk about each one a little bit more in depth. But in premise, think about this. How do we impact the city of Auburn in order to generate some economic sustainability? And it goes back to people, purpose, and place. Those three kind of talking points, if you would. How do we invest in people? How do we give them purpose and opportunity? And then how do we invest in place? That's something that A, can be proud of, and B, be an economic generator. So we came up knowing that we do have time to spend the money. We want to hold back, but we do believe that there's some quick, low-cost, smart investments that have immediate payoff, and immediate meaning in the next 12 to 18 months for the residents of Auburn and surrounding towns. So we're going to talk about each one. Liz, let's go to the next slide. I believe we have a slide for each. Some goals, right? Leveraging existing funding sources, expanding impacts of federal dollars, defining our place, cultivate and grow a vibrant, diverse workforce. A lot of these all tie in with the standards and the rulemaking from the Treasury Department, Equitable opportunity resulting in upward economic mobility. All this is also very similar and overlapping the goals that we have as a city in itself. And spur the creation of attainable housing. Next slide, please. Okay, here we go. First one. We're going to go off with the big guns. Academy Street, city-owned lot, attainable housing, owner-occupied. I asked Harriman to do an artist rendition of what a brownstone or row homes would look like on Academy Street, just to give a concept as we talk. Here's the reason. We haven't had market rate development within our downtown area in over 23 years. The market is broke. What we're seeing and what we've all been hearing from developers is it's too speculative to build market rate attainable homes at varying levels, including this concept, which really focuses on that missing middle housing market for active retirees and first-time home buyers. So we need comparisons. We need to reset the market and establish a benchmark. Second, it's our historic downtown district. We should be setting an architectural standard. It may not be that, okay? But row homes have that historical element. So again, this is a rough, and I gotta tell you, free. Thank you, Harriman, for doing a solid favor for the city of Auburn. We really appreciate it. But they're actually excited about it too. So, architectural standard, nope, back please. Don't rush me, Liz. Thanks. Architectural standard. And a couple notes. Owner occupied. What you can't see here are garden level, above grade, or half above grade, apartments for rent, i.e. we will build these as a city. I'd like to form, and we're going to propose a downtown development district, which we will seed with approximately $2 million to build these units, high density, high impact, market rate, attainable homes. We will then sell those at market rate to establish the comparables, which is the standard for future development of attainable housing of all types throughout our downtown. That money will then stay within that new nonprofit downtown development district, which will have a separate board comprised of city officials, both admin and elected, as well as businesses and residences within our defined downtown area, which currently consists of the 3 low to moderate income census tracts, which are a highlight and a focus of these funds. Okay, they can then use that money for further development and further development. So it's not just $2 million. It's taking that $2 million as seed, turning into 3, 4, 6, $20 million in capital investment over the course of the next several years within our downtown if needed. Ideally, the market takes over, okay, and all they're doing is publicity, marketing. Brian talked about the districts in Washington, D.C., getting folks in, making it a great place with purpose. Those are some of the things that can happen. So this is a pretty exciting, and I like it because, A, it's a significant amount of capital invested, but it's very, very safe, and we're going to recoup it again and be able to reuse it over and over and over again. So we're making a dollar stretch. The nonprofit could also leverage other aspects. Again, this isn't affordable. This isn't income restricted. It's the other, what nobody's doing, which is establishing market rates. Then we have the data points we need to plan out future growth at all levels within our city. Next slide. Part of the place and purpose, something that we've seen and we've talked with several folks throughout the city about, and it's been kind of on the radar. If you remember, Sabrina Best talked about a bike park as a recreational hub. We've done a lot of exploration and due diligence, pulled in some great folks that have lived outside of the state from here that have done professional Olympic level bike racing and bike competition. What we found is that New England, Maine and New Hampshire specifically, are missing. They have no Olympic certified BMX tracks, competition level tracks. The data that we'll share later on as we move forward with this, if you all are good with this, is the fact that it brings in hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. It's part of urban tourism. And let me tell you where we think this should be seated, Moulton Park. That's part of a new downtown urban park that will actually introduce and help foster the skill of biking to all ages. And if you look on this example, if you imagine this planted right in Moulton Park, on the right side would be actually Main Street and Bonnie Park, and kind of the bottom there, the south, that's actually the railroad trestle. We're talking with the Lewis and Auburn Railroad Corporation about turning 2,000 feet of that disused trail, or excuse me, rail, into trail. A large 30-foot multi-purpose pedestrian, bike, gravel, cross-country ski, urban trail that connects with Bonnie Park, that flows directly in and across to Samard Payne Park in Lewiston. So a continuation of a greenbelt trail that we think is really exciting for our future downtown growth. But we have skill areas, flow zones, from 2 years old all the way to 90. This is a true multi-generational facility. This is just an example. It's not really what it's going to look like, but it could be very, very close. Basically 3 phases. This provides a safe place for our children to learn how to ride bikes. Because I don't know what your personal experiences are, but it's really hard. We always had to put the bikes in a car, drive them someplace to teach our kids how to bicycle. This is going to provide that location downtown. And it could be part of a larger multi-phase tie-in with Barker Mill Trails, pedestrian bridges, and really taking off from the study that was done by the University of Maine in 2000, talking about that urban trailway throughout Auburn. Next slide. Downtown housing stock. To Phil's point, it's all about leveraging, okay? And this goes to people. How do we leverage existing sources of revenue stream in order to make a direct, instant impact on people's lives? So looking at our downtown, our true downtown low to moderate income census tracts, from New Auburn all the way out to Chestnut Street, and down to the river, there are significant grants from Efficiency Maine for everything from agriculture, refrigeration, water heating solutions, insulation, mini split air ducts, windows, light bulbs. And they have a varying degree of rebate based upon your income levels. What I would like to propose is putting aside $250,000 into a fund administered by the City of Auburn, which will match all the grants an individual within this area, whether it be a homeowner or a renter, receives for doing an energy efficiency grant. Similar to what we talked about yesterday with our HUD and home funds, this is less restrictive. This isn't about everything in the apartment. This is, I want to get rid of my old oil boiler and replace it with a high efficiency heat pump. Great. I'll get a $2,500 grant from Efficiency Maine and another $2,500 grant from the City of Auburn, ensuring that they have a high-quality living standard with lower cost for minimal out-of-pocket. Rehabbing our existing old housing stock, increasing value, increasing comfort, increasing quality of life and purpose. Next slide.
Mr. Mayor, just,
Sorry.
I'm sorry, what was the amount on the bike?
Oh, I missed that. I apologize. A bike track would roughly be around $300,000. We do have some already set aside in our CIP, but this would ensure that we have a true Olympic level facility, which will be literally the only one in the state of Maine. And we've already reached out to organizations that will actually love to host competitive bike and pre-Olympic qualifiers here in Auburn. It makes our biking activity we have at Mount Appetite a true weekend overnight event. You have multiple things to do. We can go into this and later, but we'll keep, but yes, $300,000. Again, $250,000 on the efficiency program. Short, quick hits, focusing on housing, focusing on energy efficiency and rehabilitation of stock, and focusing on purpose, the bike park, Moulton, expanded rail trail as a catalyst for growth. I will say there's another idea I'd like to talk about before we open it up to you all. Couldn't make a slide. I had preliminary conversations with Museum LA, their entire board of directors last week. I've had preliminary conversations with Anderson County and the City of Lewiston, talking about how the three entities can network together in order to help Museum LA launch their capital campaign sooner versus later, in order for them to build out their $19 million facility within the foreseeable future. I challenged them to come up with a regional appropriate name, a good plan, a shovel-ready plan, a fundraising plan, how they would use this money in order to maximize and leverage private and other types of contributions to get to their goal quicker versus later, in order to make a very positive impact. Now, this is interesting because it's in Lewiston, but the regional impact to Auburn is significant in our downtown. It creates a art, culture, recreation, livability corridor between our downtown and Lewiston's downtown, anchored by Community Little Theater, our new high school, to Samard Payne Park and Museum LA, and everything in between. So it's a concept, okay, that would help promote infill, increase options, and grow both communities. There's a couple other things here as well. Powell Center expansion. I don't think we have some numbers on that. By the way, Museum LA, it's a moving target. It could be anywhere from $1 to $1.5 million. Again, it would have to be matched, and there has to be some work and promissory notes. Powell Center expansion. I don't know, Phil, if you want to talk about that one.
So we had Wooded and Curran, who we work with quite closely, do, again, some free labor for us. And we talked about the Powell Center. They came in, we talked about, we had many members that have participated in the Powell program for quite some time, come into a meeting and just share with them about what a potential expansion would look like. As you know, because of COVID, the Powell Center had to close down. It's still not quite open yet at this point because originally we weren't sure what the summer numbers were going to look like. We're still running the food pantry out of the Powell Center. And so that if again, directly related to COVID response, would be an expansion would allow that integral part of that neighborhood to remain open if there was any other crisis like what we had. So Wooded and Curran provided, they're doing the work now to look at what expansion would look like. And they've given us some preliminary numbers. I know that I think a phase one Rita was coming in at, do you recall the amount?
A little over $1 million.
Yeah, and then the full build-out was about 2.5. No, I'm sorry, 4.5.
Yes.
4.5 million. So there was some different phases in it, depending on what portions you were bringing. All on that footprint is what we're waiting to see, so the council will get some really good drawings of what that could look like on that site.
Same
But
site,
same site.
same area?
Same area, yeah. But then potentially using, if you recall, there's some potential there for some additional land acquisition. So for parking, especially as we enhance programming there by utilizing that field in the back. And currently down on the Troy Barney's court, we probably are having somewhere around 100+ young people down there every night. And the futsal court is, just went out to bid yesterday, I believe it was. So that'll be another expansion of programming down there. And then we also had the Festival Plaza on here as well as originally discussions that the council is having, so we wanted to make sure we
We think, and I'd recommend too, and we were talking to Phil about it, if you remember from the proposal that we had on Festival Plaza, they talked about phase 1, phase 2. Phase 1 could be something that we implement now, which would really be the entertainment surface, the pavilion, the bandstand, maybe whatever that looks like, but that usable surface, followed up later by phase 2, which is more going down the grade into the river area. That way they don't interfere with each other during the construction phase. So I think if we start looking at this as a council, we start brainstorming good ideas for each phase. We anticipate maybe $1 million set aside for phase 1, which would be the bulk of the construction. But at least that would get this done so we can start using it as a feature of our downtown early next year. So that, we'll leave this slide up. Total, just so you have a ballpark in case you weren't keeping that running total, with everything, including Museum LA potential, we're looking at about a 5.1 to $6 million with the Powell Center Phase 1, 2. Fungible numbers, less than half, on the high side on the estimates to be conservative. But again, looking about people, purpose, place, does it make sense? And what other ideas do you have? Or questions? And we'll open it up now.
I guess I'd like all of the ideas, but I would like to see more connectivity for the parks and the other areas to make it more of a walkable area.
It's a great idea.
So enhanced trail networks connecting Bonnie Park with Moulton Field, with New Auburn, so on. Okay.
Well, I'd also,
Gill, and making it, even connecting it in to Lewiston, so that it's gigantic, because that ties in with LA,
It does. Yeah.
and it make it one gigantic walking area along the lines of like Back Bay.
So we're talking with Lewiston, I'm talking as a board member of the Lewiston Auburn Railroad Corporation on Thursday morning. They have done this project in Lewiston. I'm going to ask them to fund this project in Auburn, which is 2,000 feet of discarded rail to trail that will directly tie into Bonnie Park, which will then, obviously, the walking path tie into Lewiston. They're also talking about expanding the trail to Lisbon from Lewiston too. So there's, so we'll definitely hit that and then some.
Will the park, the bicycle, be able to connect up through the new high school and come back down that direction?
We haven't looked at that, but that's a great point. We can.
Oh, it certainly can. So there has been designs in the past, and I probably have to go back and look to see which one that was, that connected to the trail, the snake trail. But where it comes out, I think there were some designs on that we could easily look at, that comes up Hutchins Street and is able to cross.
Any other questions? And I don't want to forget Councilor Boss. Councilor Boss?
Thank you. Just two quick questions. The first is, have we considered an indoor or outdoor swimming facility? Just given our meeting last night and talking about the need for swimming and water safety education.
There has been talk over the last couple of years about indoor aquatic facilities. Those talks are kind of still ongoing with partners. So I'll say yes, but I'll also couch it with, too premature.
We can just, Brian will give you an update on where we are. You did allocate funds for a study, and Brian, do you want to share where you're at on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are in the process, put together a group to draft an RFP, and have had several responses, and in the final stages of selecting a consultant to kind of help look at, I think, what was originally billed as a turf facility, but I think as council's really kind of indicated a desire for a more robust sports facility, and kind of in keeping with a notion of this being a sports tourism destination. So really expanding what that would look like from, another Ingersoll to a more robust facility, and including some type of water feature or potentially a pool, and then identifying a few different sites. So that's moving forward, and hopefully we'll be able to have a final selection, and then from that report, really be able to delve into what that would look like, the investments, and different methodologies that might be available to make that project come to life, if that's the direction that council wants to go in. So yes, in answer to your question, a sports facility with a water feature is definitely something that we're looking at.
That's great, thank you. And I'll just quickly add my next question, which is that if, and it doesn't have to be now, but it would be great to see from staff kind of mapping on these initial strategies and ideas on top of our strategic plan, and seeing where they fit in.
Great.
Absolutely.
Councilor Zanya?
Thank you. I love all of this, and I love how we're hitting sort of every constituent, every group, every community through this. So I really appreciate that. So in terms of, you talked about a 12 to 18 months. I mean, I'm looking at all of this, with this funding, this is doable. And if that's sort of the time frame in theory, but then also who is the working group that kind of moves this forward? I mean, is it the city staff that then presents different aspects to the council that is voted on? I know you don't know all the details, but just sort of what is the process that you envision?
Well, so 12 to 18 months. There's certain things, I'll tell you right now, the BMX bike park, and it can absolutely be done next year, for next spring, summer. So that can meet the time frame. I think it might be aggressive with Festival Plaza, but based upon our communication, yeah. I think the townhome or row home concept might take a bit longer. And the Efficiency Maine grant reimbursements could happen fairly quickly. I'll let Phil talk about kind of that procedure going forward, but I do believe this is a high priority type issue for us.
So the work group is the council. So this will be the work group as we move forward. We're not looking for any special work group. I think this is really going to land with all of you. The summit, the regional summit, is so that we can continue bringing back information about what's happening with Androscoggin County that received 22 million, and then Lewiston also 20-some million. So there's efforts that are going to take place there. I think that work group, that summit work group, will continue. I think there was certainly interest around the room to keep that as a small group, to really take a look at those key focus areas. And then we'll be bringing back to them, just like Lewiston will, recommendations that you all are bringing, and that information will flow back and forth. So I think that'll be important, but the work product will be done here. And we can work on a timeline. As we said, 2024 is what you have. So you have plenty of time to really methodically think this through and say, okay, what projects can we move forward? The other piece is, we've been working on a lot of projects. We're about ready to catch our breath on the Lake Auburn study, but we know that's going to create future work, right? And so comp plan, we're coming up for air on that, and we know that's going to create a little bit more future work. So we really want to work on, and I know you know this from me, is really identifying a strong work plan. You'll see that for the next 6 months, and in that process, I'll be working with you to determine how fast do you want to move on this. And we'll work those more workshops as we move along. But that's the thought.
So do you think a tentative work plan would be in July, or, I mean, I'm not pressing you, this could be pretty aggressive, and it should be in some sense, so I'm just curious.
I think we'll come
'Cause a
back
month could
before
make a
you
difference.
at a workshop in August.
Okay, thank you.
And then at that workshop in August, and it'll probably be the second meeting in August, that'll allow the summit group to meet again and share some information that's come out from that group. Allows for all of you to start thinking about a list as well. And I really, what will be helpful is if we can get into a workshop and just be able to kind of be creatively
Yeah.
come up with thoughts and ideas and build up. That's how that initial list came together.
And you some of the
so-
smart
That's right. Yeah.
goals that you
So I
processed.
see that in August.
Yep.
That next initial group.
And if there's, and I'll get to Steve in a second, but if there's also nothing up there that's glaringly horrible as a consensus, item, I mean, I gotta tell you, Bike Park, I'll hammer on that. We are so lucky to have Chris Riley from Mount Appetite, a lot, Mike, we've got a bunch of smart people. They'll do the work for us. We just have to nod and say, great. So, I mean, and that's an extreme, but I know for a fact that they're already working on plans on designing to scale. So we do have some luck there. We got a great community that we can really tap into. Councilor Milks?
I love all the ideas up there. I'm going to channel Councilor Walker. Is there a plan to allocate some of these funds to ongoing maintenance of all of these things? Because this reminds me of kind of like the old WPA stadiums and things like that were done in the Depression, and they sustained because people maintained them over, and I was playing in one well after it was built, 50, 60 years later. So we're going to need to maintain these, and can we take some of this money and allocate them towards a fund or something that's self-propelling to be able to maintain specifically towards these projects?
So we'll work through that. Rita is the one that keeps me, I won't use the term that I normally use, but Rita keeps me on the straight and narrow when it comes to what can we do with funds and what we can't.
Okay.
And that's something that Rita will look through. As the mayor talked about being able to create, I think we called it the Downtown District nonprofit group that may oversee some of those parks and activities. A direct allocation to a group like that would then allow those funds to carry on beyond.
That's, I guess,
that
is what
initiative.
I'm saying.
Yeah,
As much as
absolutely.
whether or not
Yeah.
it's those funds, what's the plan?
Yeah.
Because we
So-
want to, if this is a once-in-a-generation investment, let's make sure
Maintain
that the next generation and the next generation
Yeah.
can enjoy it.
I
and
did
take
have, this past week, we had a leadership retreat with the directors. And part of that, and it was a great day that we were able to spend with them. It's the first time that Brian and I were really able to spend that time with them without COVID restrictions and being able to connect and brainstorm together. But some of the initiatives that we're looking at is an asset management plan when it comes to maintaining and actually forecasting out what is our maintenance, and then what's that replacement look like, and being able to forecast that out over the next 20 years. So, so the team knows that that's a priority and one that we'll be working on.
We could do that for the school, too.
Yeah, once the model's in place, you can place anything into it, that's right.
Wow. Last
Channeling Councilor.
Any last questions or comments on this, Councilor Gary?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a great list. The only one that I have any real concerns is Festival Plaza. Because of its, I'm not going to say I don't want it done. The direction I'm coming from is it's such a small area that we try to get so many people in, and even if we try to expand down towards the riverfront, it's only so many people you can get in there. So the more stuff that we put into it, like those pretty designs that we saw, we're not going to be able to put as many people as if we try to leave it open and put amenities and pretty things around it. Because I'd like to see that space as open as we can. And also, I would like to see it spill over into the parking lot across the street.
Well, when we have a visioning exercise with members of the community for Festival Plaza, very similar to what we did with the high school amenities and what people want, and some designers, because there's some great theories on this, i.e. you want to build the space smaller than your anticipated crowd, so it brings in community. There's actually a lot of theories on that, on space to people ratios. So let's all talk about that once we get into that process.
But you need to have an area for your, like, your New Year's Eve.
Well, when we get to that part, I think the question I have, and I'd like to part with everybody, is this. Is there anything on the list right now that you even have, like, regardless of festival, do you just have a real big problem, or even a small problem with it? I mean, we try to be extremely tight, impactful, leaving a lot of money for the next council, for you, for other initiatives. Is there anything in there that just bothers you, even in the slightest?
I'm not bothered at all. What I'm wondering is if we can also look at some of this through the lens of public health. Physical activity with the built environment, I think that that's sort of one thing that is missing in terms of just helping us to look at each one through that lens.
Okay. Yes.
I don't have any comments about what's on there. I do notice that broadband's not on there, so the digital connection and connecting.
We believe broadband is a fad, and the internet will be going away in the next.
Oh,
summer.
perfect. Well, carry on then.
We didn't touch upon infrastructure, but that was a catch-all.
Okay,
I mean, there's some
gotcha.
ideas we batted around about encouraging people to sign up or to build new along existing infrastructure and providing a cash incentive for tying into an existing water and sewer or broadband or
Yeah,
whatever.
that infrastructure line item isn't in the total that the mayor,
No,
Okay.
no.
so that's a separate,
That's
that
separate.
would be, okay, all
Gotcha.
Yeah, there's a lot of, but again, that whole internet fad thing. Anything else? Anything that really, because if not, I mean, I'd like to start working a little bit more with Harriman and, some civic groups and just gathering more information for you to start looking at before any final decisions. This is not a decision point. This is just, Phil's gonna need it for his work plans and his work. I wanna gather more intel.
Those housing units that you want to discuss, they gotta be handicapped accessible. They
Probably
gotta
not.
be- Then isn't that gonna be discrimination?
No, because it's market rate. It's not affordable. And when I say probably not, I say it in the nicest way, though, Kurt, because in that traditional brownstone historical district, they were handicap accessible. And in this one, to maximize capacity, there's a walk down for 4 feet into the garden basement apartment and a walk up 4-ish feet for the main 2 floors of owner occupied. But again, and I say it because traditionally, Philadelphia, Baltimore, any other Washington, D.C., Boston, Portland. I think every city outside of Auburn, frankly, south of Auburn, they had this as part of the mix. Now, doesn't mean we won't have handicap accessible buildings. We will. We do have a lot now. But these are for the attainable market rate to see what's out there. So yeah, short answer is on that plan, no. Anything else? Any other feedback? Okay, great. Thank you very much. We'll end this. We'll keep working forward. We're going to move on. It's almost 8. Let's see if we can plow through this. The next thing on our agenda is Eric Cousins. We're going to talk about our comprehensive plan chapters that the Comp Plan Review Committee has pushed forward. I will say for those that are just joining in or coming to the audience, we're going to pull away the future land use chapter out of discussion and presentation tonight, simply because in light of the water analysis, like Auburn Water Study, Dana Little is here too, or Staples, I'm sorry. We're going to have some work to do in the next 30 days to integrate some of that science and data into that FLU. So, Eric, I'll let you handle the other chapters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and City Council. I hope you can see the first screen of the PowerPoint. It looks like you can.
Yep.
What we have tonight is the work of the Comprehensive Plan Committee. They put in a lot of work, a lot of meetings, and they've also put in a lot of time in between meetings to provide feedback, comments, edits, and really make our meetings as efficient as they can be. In particular, I want to thank Dana Staples, who is in the audience, has acted as our chair and has done a great job facilitating. And on the staff side, Megan Norwood has put a lot of work into this. She's done a great job with the meetings and being prepared for them. And then sort of a late arrival, John Blaze, our urban development specialist, has also been a great contributor. It's excited to be at this stage. We have a couple of chapters, additional chapters that are ready to be passed along to you, and hopefully, if you're comfortable, be able to send them along to the planning board to really start the official process of adoption that includes at least 2 additional public hearings, one at the planning board and one at the council. The first chapter you had already sent, recreation open space, the first one that was ready, went to the planning board for a workshop last month. A lot of positive feedback on that. We expect at the July meeting with some advice on how to promote the assets that are highlighted in the plan, that will probably have a recommendation from the planning board back to the council for approval of that chapter. We'll also hold a public hearing at that meeting. The transportation section, you've seen that. It's largely unchanged, some minor tweaks based on the public feedback sessions. And then the third chapter that is before you tonight, the promoting food access and growing the agricultural economy. That one is an entirely new chapter that really tried to address issues that weren't addressed in our previous comp plan. We had some agricultural directives, but really not food access and how to make sure local food is available to everybody. Transportation, really not any major changes based on this last community conversations survey and public input session. There were some tweaks made to our gateways in order to support the future land use changes that were being recommended. Again, the primary goals utilize all of our existing roads, infrastructure, and really use transportation to drive real estate growth patterns. Make sure that our network of streets is safe for all users, that's bicycles, pedestrians, and automobiles, and maintain and enhance a multimodal hub. In particular, one of the major, I think, forward-thinking recommendations that this group has come up with is the idea that a new turnpike interchange would not be focused on commercial development around it, as that's failed the test in the past, couldn't justify the environmental impacts or the transportation benefits, and really could support South Auburn near an exit 77 being a more residential area, an expansion of residential opportunity, and really just integrate the turnpike into our road network to relieve pressures elsewhere where they have more impacts on people walking, that kind of thing. Really allow for infill development from a new turnpike exit down through Washington Street, what is now Washington Street northbound, and trying to move some of the fast moving through traffic from Washington Street northbound to an eventual two-way Washington Street southbound, and really create an opportunity to re-envision what is now Washington Street North as a gateway to the city and as a center for new mixed-use development, including residential. Again, the turnpike really hasn't changed since the last time you've seen it, the recommendations, but really to allow for increases in density and to allow for commuter traffic to reside here in Auburn, even if they work to our south with easy access to the turnpike. It would support additional grid-style road network. One of the goals would be to try to fill in a grid between Broad Street and South Main Street currently. That's going to take a significant effort on the public side as well as the private side, but really to try to extend that traditional grid street network that is so desirable in New Auburn, the neighborhoods that people love in New Auburn, really try to extend that opportunity to more lots and more people out towards the turnpike along South Main Street. The brand new chapter that hasn't been presented to the council is the promoting food access and growing the agricultural economy. Really brings in elements that we didn't have in the previous agricultural-based recommendations that really focused on commercial agriculture and didn't really even consider equitable access to all, regardless of income or geography, making sure that fresh local food is available to everybody. Part of this is driven by the equity lens that we're using for the review of all of the chapters that are up for discussion. And it's been clear from the council's discussions over the last couple of years that local food and local food access is a high priority, as well as in our strategic plan. And the comp plan really just didn't have a chapter to address that until now. It still supports growing Auburn's existing farming capacity, but really expands that from truly commercial operations to also supporting existing or new subsistence farming operations, people growing their own food, and then community and commercial gardening as part of that. One of the major shortcomings of our food network in the area is facilities for processing and storing food products that are grown locally, animal protein meat processing facilities. There are a lot of farmers that are shipping their animals out of state. We've heard stories of large pig farmers to the north of us even shipping their animals to Pennsylvania to be processed, packaged, and sent back to Maine. Huge inefficiency, huge additional expenses that take away from the profitability of farming here, and a lot of fuel that's used that wouldn't have to be used if we had a facility in our area. We really see an opportunity with the funding that you just discussed and the interest sort of regionally that Auburn could be sort of that hub where surrounding towns are having their food processed and made available not only in Auburn, but to markets surrounding us. And then to really look at what other things can we do to support food-related businesses. We don't have all the answers, but this really sets a goal to dig into that and figure out what the needs are and find ways to support local food. Auburn has a real opportunity because of the large undeveloped areas in our northern and southern ends of the community to be a real leader as a city in the state in producing food. So with that, hearing the discussion earlier tonight on the After the Lake Auburn watershed study, it sounds like the council wants to push the future land use chapters back to the committee. Unless there's a desire to go through those in detail tonight, we'll plan on doing that on another night. I will say that the most significant changes to any of the chapters that you've reviewed and then sent back out for community conversations and public feedback, there were some substantial changes made based on that feedback to the future land use maps. And they really center on areas that couldn't support density that was initially proposed as efficiently as other areas because of lack of utilities, and also some sort of neighborhood-specific feedback that we received about our zoning, where it really just wasn't facilitating any meaningful use of the land. And people that were sort of stuck in a category that wasn't economically viable. In particular, along Hackett Road, there was a small residential area change. It doesn't really support industrial development, and really trying to figure out what the best use of those lands are and recommend changes in the future to our zoning. With that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions, and staff really believes, and I think the committee in sending these to the council, that the promoting food access and growing the ag economy chapter is ready for the public hearing process, as well as the transportation chapter, if you're willing to send that along to planning board.
So Council, anybody, any questions about those two chapters right now? Councilor Zani and Councilor Boss, if we could, excuse me, Councilor Gary. If we could just make sure, but Councilor Boss is up on the screen somewhere.
Did you want to go to?
No, Councilor Zani first.
Oh, okay, thank you. Just very quickly, thank you for this. In the third bullet down from there, do you mean facilitate and support the development of processors of all types of healthy food? It says all sizes of healthy food. Maybe you meant that. And thank you for the goat pictures.
I love
Yes,
those are
I
amazing.
think that would be scale and types, so we can adjust that. And make sure that you'll see it again anyways if there's any concerns with that language.
Thank you.
Councilor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When you talk about trying to initiate having a processing plant to process the foods for people, I mean, growers or farmers, whoever, to use, have you thought of using any of the land in, like, in the industrial zone, something near maybe the intermodal facility, so that if they do want to ship animals, they could be brought there and either transported live or processed and then shipped out?
Yeah, staff has been having some discussions about where could a facility like this be located, and it does have to support, large truck traffic, and potentially even high volumes of truck traffic. So our industrial zone is really the place where we have roads to support that type of traffic. There are some of them that are not far from our agricultural zones, as well as water and sewer would be critical to support that type of facility. So I think the industrial zone is probably the most likely place for a facility like that in Auburn.
Thank you.
Councilor Boss, you're on this committee. Do you want to make a last comment here? I keep looking for you, but there you're somewhere. You're there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. I just want to thank Eric for the presentation. I think he really summed it up beautifully. And I just want to also say that in speaking with many people across the state, folks that work in food systems and that work in agriculture, many people see Auburn as a prime location in the state that's unique for holding a food processing facility, specifically because of our size and our land mass and our proximity to different types of transportation. So I do think it's a really viable industry that we could be supporting and should look at that very seriously.
Very good. I think, and I know the city manager's had some pretty preliminary but extensive conversations about this as well. So, maybe in the next couple of months we'll have enough intelligence to bring back to the council about viability, location, so forth, and cost. Okay, with that, Councilor Leroy Walker.
I would guess that if we're looking at our people here in Auburn, we're probably talking about Bell's, Rickers, but who would be the big farmers other than that would be behind us on this support?
Well, I think there's an opportunity for people raising livestock as well. And there's demand for local livestock or additional farms, but a lot of people are limited by, Bell would be a good example. He was not able to expand his markets to the degree that he has until he built a really expensive, high quality storage facility. He can store potatoes now in the fall and sell them through the following growing season to large retail outlets, including Walmart. There's a lack of those types of facilities that I think has held back production, because you can, if you grow 1 million tomatoes and you have to sell them in a week and a half before they spoil, you can't do that. But if you find ways to process them, add value, and sell them over the course of the next year, it really can create a new opportunity for a farm business that's viable. Same thing with processing animals. I think there is an opportunity to produce more animals, but one of the limiting factors is that there's no place to have them processed in a USDA inspected facility at certain times of the year when most people are trying to do that because they're overbooked.
I think as the mayor mentioned, maybe a future workshop, we did have a really great, I think we probably spent more than an hour with the executive director of Good Shepherd Food Bank, who's probably within the state of Maine, probably at the front end of looking at what to do with exactly what Eric was just referring to, and that's how do we take a very short grow season and be able to expand that so that we're feeding people throughout the year without bringing fruits and vegetables from China or wherever else they might be coming from, and being able to keep food local and be able to do that. And Good Shepherd Food Bank is spending a lot of money on research, a lot of money digging into this, and the fact that we were able to spend over an hour with the executive director just talking about this opened our eyes to everything that we've talked about right here tonight. They have done the research on this. They are coming out with a potential model that they're looking at, and it is a big lift, and it's challenging. I think Councilor Carrier kind of looked at me regarding storage, which is very different than the processing component, which is really challenging, and the fact that they're able to take a look, they're able to leverage an industry that's currently exists, that's not in use year-round, to be able to leverage other crop to come in and be able to process. It's fascinating. I think it's important to listen to, and we'll reach out to see if she could come in and talk with the council, because it is eye-opening to try to really see what's taking place in the region and where the demand is, because that's that other component. The demand piece, they've done their research. They know what Auburn has. They know what the region has. They know where they need to move this product and how to then take that and get it back out to where it needs to. So we'll reach out, and I'll ask to see if she could come in, or someone from her board, and be able to present that, because I think that would be important.
Have you guys thought of a cannery, or is that part of the
That's
process?
part of processing.
That's part of that process.
Getting,
Yeah.
Cannery to flash frozen, as well as a little bit of meat. And there's some pros and cons to everything. There's market demands, fluctuations, and the first thing you do in business is you look for unused capacity at current facilities that you don't have to absorb the entire fit-out cost for. But we'll let the executive director speak about this one. Again, there's still preliminary on our end, but on their end, they're years ahead of us, to the point where they have committed funding. So we'll let them talk about that. And they're in Auburn, which is awesome, okay? And we're lucky to have them as a resource. And they have done so many great things for Auburn in a lot of different ways, and we're pretty grateful for that. So, Eric, Phil, at this point, we're not in a council meeting. We don't have to have a vote and send these forward. If we have some consensus amongst here in a workshop to move these forward to planning board, remember, it's all going to come back to you, okay? It will come back to you in multiple forms, initially for adoption, and then if there's any action post-adoption, it has to come back again. So this is just a plan. It's a first step. So unless there's any major opposition to sending one or both of these out, I'd like to, feel like I think can read the room and go forward. Okay?
I would like to see this presentation in hand to look it over, to see if there's anything I'd like to see, ask questions about or add to.
We can email everyone the presentation.
And of course, you can please be part of the planning board process, or wait till they finish, and then add your recommendations when it comes back to council as well, which is always within the council's purview to do.
So in other words, if it goes to the planning board, they do what they need to do to it, it comes back to us. So can we workshop it before we see it on agenda for?
Of course, you'll have to. You'll have to workshop it, look at it all over. We're gonna have public comment, and it's gonna come back in the form of an order of acceptance, in which turn you can then amend the comprehensive plan if you'd like. And again, it's just a plan, it's not the rule, okay? So, yeah, but you will have that opportunity, council's purview.
Eric, can we just talk through timeline, if this goes back to planning board through consensus? And we want to work through that, because we've had a few things that have come back up about regarding consensus. And so, but just initially, Eric, if this goes back to the planning board, what would that timeline look for that to be turned around?
I think we could get it to them at their July 13th meeting. I know that they wanted to workshop the rec recommendations and then hold a public meeting, so I would suspect something similar, but we can follow whatever we have for a council directive. I would plan on workshop July 13th, public hearing the second Tuesday in August, and then back to council.
So council, what we'll do is tentatively through consensus, we'll push this back for Eric to make that request to the planning board. What we will do as a consent item is we will add your directive to then officially send that to planning board at the August 2nd meeting. And so that way there, that, we do have that, and we're following that process. So, I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, yes, July 19th. Yeah, I skipped a meeting. So July 19th, we could do that. So it'll be on your consensus packet, and if something changes from then, you can certainly pull that out, but at least that way planning board can get started.
Are we,
That'll give us,
are we looking to the private sector to build this type of thing, or are we looking for the city to be taking this on?
Well, I tell you what, I will absolutely advocate that it's a partnership between the private sector and a nonprofit collaborative with slight, if no, hopefully no, city integration or involvement, other than facilitating, encouraging, promoting.
Yeah, I would think that would be the smartest thing we can do, because if we want to go back 60 years and look at what we had right in this city and the surrounding towns,
Right behind here was a meat processing.
they're
plant.
all gone. And they're all gone for a reason, or nobody's come back with any of that, so.
So it's a goal, it's something to look at, it's in the plan, we're already looking at it, because it makes sense too. But we'll come back with everything and all the data, so the council can make an educated decision based upon the data. Yeah?
Eric, did you have something else? I thought you were speaking.
no, I was just going to say that July 19th meeting would give us time to publish all the required public notices for a hearing in August.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, we're gonna call the workshop as over at 3.25 hours. Great job tonight, folks. Big monumental day for Auburn. Councilor Boss, enjoy your vacation. Now she's vacation shaming me.
I know.